A storm rolled across the Levantine coast like a living thing, dragging sheets of black rain across the waves. The research vessel groaned as each swell lifted it skyward before slamming it down again, its metal frame trembling under the weight of the night. The dive team waited in silence, helmets under their arms, the deck lights flickering against their tense faces. Every instinct told them this was the wrong time to descend, but the window of opportunity was closing. Weeks of scanning, sleepless nights, and a trail of nearly forgotten academic rumors had brought them here. One more delay and the currents would shift, burying everything again beneath the drifting sands of the seabed. When the order finally came, go, the world narrowed to the cold embrace of the Mediterranean. The storm muted, replaced by a rising hum from the deep. The diver's light cut through the darkness in thin beams that vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the silt rising around them. They followed a rope line toward a trench mapped earlier that week, a jagged split along the ocean floor that shouldn't have existed. No known fault line cut through this region. And yet, something had shifted recently, exposing a cavity beneath the limestone shelf. The lead diver reached the drop first. His hand brushed against the edge, and a cloud of fine sediment drifted upward like smoke. As he descended into the crevice, the temperature fell sharply, a sudden drop that made his breath hitch inside the mask. His pulse hammered. It felt as though he were trespassing, as though the trench itself exhaled. At the bottom, the light of his torch passed over broken amphorae, shattered stone fragments, and the remnants of a structure long collapsed. The team had expected another Phoenician harbor, another pile of typical trade goods. Instead, this place felt older, untouched by any cataloged civilization. The walls bore faint carvings almost erased by thousands of years of currents. Strange spirals, interlocking arcs, a pattern that pulsed in the diver's peripheral vision like a heartbeat. He motioned to the others. 2 beams joined his, scanning the seafloor with slow, careful sweeps. Minutes ticked by. The storm above pressed downward, sending a low rumble through the depths, vibrating through the divers' chests. Then the lead diver's light caught something, a shape half buried in silt, its edges too straight, too deliberate to be natural. They moved closer. The object was rectangular, heavy, and carved from a dark stone unlike anything recovered from the region. Its surface glistened beneath the thin film of sand. The diver brushed the top, revealing a symbol carved so deeply it seemed to pierce the stone itself. A coiling serpent with a crown of stylized waves above its head. The lines seemed ancient yet unervingly precise, as if meant to endure the crushing pressure of the deep. For a moment no one moved. The water around them felt thicker, heavier. A faint vibration ran along the diver's fingertips, so subtle he wasn't sure if it was real or just the thundering of his own pulse. He leaned closer, brushing away more silt. Beneath the serpent, he could see the faint outlines of cuneiform signs. Not the tidy wedges of standardized Akkadian, but something older, more primitive, carved with an intensity that suggested the message mattered desperately to whoever engraved it. The diver signaled the camera unit. As the floodlight illuminated the stone, the inscriptions stood out in stark relief. Some symbols were familiar references to water, chaos, depth, but many were unlike anything catalogued in established Semitic lexicons. They felt wrong, or perhaps simply forgotten, belonging to a vocabulary that had drowned long before the earliest cities were built. A sudden tremor rippled through the trench, sending dust and shell fragments drifting like ash. The team flinched. Rocks above shifted with a low groan. They were running out of time. The lead diver hooked a lifting strap beneath the tablet's edge. It was heavier than expected, impossibly so. As they pulled, it resisted, as if something still held it in place. For a moment, the diver felt a bizarre sensation. The stone seems warm, like a creature's skin beneath the fingertips. He shook the thought away, pulled harder, and the tablet finally came free. As they ascended through the shaft, the waters around them churned with rising sediment. The trench groaned behind them, collapsing inch by inch. By the time they reached the surface, the sea had erupted into a frenzy of wind and rain. The crew hauled them on board while thunder cracked overhead like splitting stone. Every wave felt like a warning, a reminder that something buried had just been disturbed. The tablet was placed onto the deck under a canopy of frantic voices and camera flashes. Even covered in mud, the serpent symbol radiated a cold gravity. The ship's archaeologist leaned close, his lips parting in awe as he traced the lines of the cuneiform. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and then fear. There had been whispers of a lost set of tablets. Mentions scattered through colonial-era notebooks, obscure journals from the 1930s, and a single footnote in a forgotten monograph. Texts linked not to Baal, not to El, not to any god catalogued in the Levantine pantheon, but to something older. Something the ancients feared so profoundly they destroyed every altar and erased every name. A sea god whose worship was said to have disappeared not gradually, but violently. Suppressed. Buried. Lightning illuminated the tablet once more, casting the serpent's twisting coils into stark silhouette. The archaeologist stepped back, almost stumbling, his mind racing through the fragments he recalled from decades-old research. A single word formed on his lips, a name scholars debated, dismissed, or avoided entirely. Behind him, the storm raged, the sea rising in jagged, rhythmic swells as if stirred by some unseen force. The winds howled across the deck, echoing a sound that almost resembled a growl. The crew worked to steady the ship, shouting over the chaos. But the archaeologist didn't hear them. His eyes were fixed on the ancient carving, on the crown above the serpent's head, on the inscription carved with desperate precision. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, a name half believed, half feared, a name the world had tried to forget, a name the sea had not. The rumors began quietly, almost accidentally, like waves brushing against a forgotten shore. In dusty academic journals from the 1930s, the kind printed in small batches and distributed to scholars whose names no one remembers, scattered references appeared to an unnamed set of tablets retrieved from an unclassified coastal ruin somewhere along the eastern Mediterranean. The descriptions were frustratingly vague, the language cautious, as if the authors themselves feared putting too much into print. They spoke of symbols, unlike known Phoenician or Ugaritic forms, of a serpentine emblem, and of an unknown hydrous deity. Then the mentions abruptly stopped, replaced by footnotes, ellipses, and missing pages. Entire issues of those journals became difficult to find, some surviving only as single copies in private collections. Later researchers dismissed this as sloppy early archaeology, overexcited scholars misidentifying artifacts amid a frenzy of colonial-era digs. But a handful of specialists kept seeing patterns, seeing phrases like the deep one, the crowned serpent, and those who served the tide. Too many coincidences, too many fragmentary allusions to a god that official histories never bothered naming. And in every mention, one phrase appeared again and again: Tablets of the Leviathan Cult. Not as a formal title, but as a shorthand scribbled in margins, suggesting this wasn't a new discovery even then. It was a rumor passed quietly among epigraphers who sensed they were dealing with something outside the comfortable boundaries of documented myth. The trail twisted deeper as the decades passed. In the early 20th century, a pair of French archaeologists working near the ancient harbor of Arwood documented a set of tablets presented to them by local fishermen. According to their notes, preserved only because one of them mailed a summary to a colleague, the tablets bore carvings of a serpent rising from stylized waves. Days after reporting the find, both men disappeared en route to Beirut, their small vessel found capsized, their crates missing. Their names faded into the long list of colonial-era researchers lost to travel accidents, disease, or political unrest. But their letter survived, tucked inside a folder of unrelated correspondences. It was the first modern mention of a coiled sea serpent deity whose name is struck out in the text. Later, in the 1950s, an obscure archaeology newsletter reported a British expedition's discovery of submerged ritual stonework with pre-Semitic inscriptions relating to a water sovereign. The article ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if truncated before printing. No follow-up edition ever addressed it. The publisher folded soon afterward, and most copies of that issue disappeared into private hands. Only a single surviving photograph of the page, grainy, damaged at the corners, hints at the discovery. In the margin, someone had handwritten, Eldane. It became a pattern. Strange finds, abrupt silences. A scholar presents a translation at a conference, then withdraws it the following week. A museum registers a new artifact on its incoming log, only for it to be marked lost in transit days later. At first these seemed like mundane bureaucratic mishaps, the kind of errors that plague underfunded institutions. But when archivists later compared notes, they realized this cluster of losses surrounded only a specific category of objects. Tablets featuring serpents, waves, or references to a primordial sea. By the 1970s, the Leviathan Tablets had become a fringe legend in academic circles, whispered at conferences, joked about in late-night discussions, the way scholars sometimes tease each other about cursed manuscripts or forbidden codices. And yet, underneath the humor, many felt something uneasy. Too many missing artifacts. Too many vanished researchers. Too many journals quietly retracting articles with no explanation. It began to feel as if the subject itself resisted exposure, as though the tablets remained just out of reach by design. Among those who pursued the truth, a subtle fear took hold. Some who claimed to have seen portions of the tablets insisted they felt deeply unsettled afterward, not because the content was violent or shocking, but because the inscriptions seemed designed to manipulate memory. One scholar admitted in a private letter that he felt watched whenever he sat down to study his notes. Another described hearing a rhythmic sound, like waves striking from inside a closed room, whenever he examined the serpent symbol for too long. Whether these were psychological responses to obsession or something stranger, no one could prove. But the stories endured. The line between academic curiosity and myth-making blurred further when a German linguist published a brief article in 1981 describing a fragment he believed belonged to the same corpus. He cited references to the king beneath the waters and the crowned coil. The article vanished from circulation within a month, and the linguist himself publicly recanted his findings. When pressed in interviews, he became visibly distressed, insisting he had been mistaken and that the tablet fragment never existed. Yet colleagues later confirmed he had indeed possessed a stone piece with wave-like engravings, shown to a small group after a lecture. What happened to it remains unknown. The deeper researchers dug, the more the legend twisted. Some believed the tablets were part of an obscure Phoenician cult whose rites were aggressively erased during the rise of later civilizations. Others suspected they belonged to a pre-Phoenician culture entirely. A few whispered, cautiously, that the texts might describe a being older than the known pantheons. A sea deity so feared, so powerful, that later religions demonized it into near non-existence. And through all of this, the tablets themselves refused to materialize. They drifted through the 20th century like ghosts, appearing in rumors, disappearing in accidents, leaving only faint impressions on the people who chased their truth. It was as if every discovery generated a counterforce. A fire here, a theft there, a sudden death, a misplaced archive. Not enough to convince the public of a conspiracy, but enough to make those who studied the phenomenon quiet their research or abandon it altogether. But one detail rose above the fog: the serpent symbol. The coiled figure with a crowned head appeared in every scattered mention, in every unreliable sketch, in every whispered story. Scholars argued over its origin, some linking it to Baal's defeat of Lawton in Ugaritic myth, others suggesting a proto-Canaanite water deity. But one troubling observation remained. The serpent on the supposed Leviathan tablets was depicted not as a monster defeated by a hero, but as a sovereign crowned, enthroned, commanding the depths. And that inversion bothered scholars the most, because across the Near East, the sea was chaos, a force to be mastered or destroyed. But here, in these half-lost accounts, the sea was portrayed as a ruler, a teacher, a giver of knowledge, something too potent for later cultures to tolerate. By the late 20th century, the legend of the Leviathan Tablets had become a labyrinth of contradictions, a story with dozens of starting points and no clear end. Yet despite the missing artifacts, the vanished records, and the scholars who refused to speak, a faint thread still connected every clue. A whisper repeated across time, hidden between lost pages and forbidden inscriptions. Something had existed. Something had been carved. Something the ancient world feared, yet also revered. Something that the sea, in its unbroken memory, might still be waiting to reveal again. He was described as quiet, almost painfully meticulous, the kind of scholar who lived more comfortably among broken shards of pottery than among people. Dr. Elias Moretti had grown up in the narrow streets of Genoa, where the sea was both a guardian and a warning. His father was a fisherman who taught him early to respect the ocean's moods, and his mother a schoolteacher who filled his nights with stories of ancient kings and forgotten gods. Perhaps it was inevitable that he would spend his life searching for something that belonged to both worlds, a piece of history shaped by the deep. By the early 1950s, Moretti had become one of Europe's most promising epigraphers, fluent in 6 ancient languages, rumored to be working on a 7th. His colleagues admired him, though some whispered that his obsession with pre-Semitic Levantine inscriptions bordered on unhealthy. He was the type of scholar who would vanish into archives for days, emerging with smudged fingers and a feverish gleam in his eyes. He published quietly, precisely, without ambition for fame. The people who knew him best said he wasn't chasing recognition. He was chasing a puzzle. His fascination intensified when he stumbled across an obscure reference in a damaged French monograph. A line about the broken texts of the crowned serpent. The phrasing struck him like a spark thrown onto dry tinder. Within months, he had requested funding for an expedition to Lebanon, insisting he had identified a cluster of undocumented inscriptions near ancient Byblos. Most thought him overly optimistic, but his academic reputation was solid enough that his request passed. In 1954, Moretti arrived in Beirut, then a vibrant crossroads of scholars, traders, and wanderers. He stayed at a small hotel near the port, spending his days interviewing fishermen, traders, and elderly residents who remembered stories their grandparents once told. Many laughed off his questions about strange symbols or sea serpent carvings, but a few reacted with discomfort, as if he had touched upon a memory they preferred not to revisit. One old man refused to speak at all, turning away with a muttered prayer. Weeks turned into months. Moretti's notebooks filled with sketches, transcriptions, and stray comments overheard in markets. He grew thinner, more restless. His letters to colleagues became fragmented, swinging between excitement and unease. One moment he'd write about discovering a pattern in the wavelines. The next he'd confess to feeling like something is missing from the equation, something intentionally removed. The breakthrough came when a smuggler, known locally simply as Omar, approached him with a proposition. For the right price, Omar claimed, he could show Moretti a stone fragment recovered from a collapsed sea cave south of Sidon. Moretti hesitated. He knew the risks of dealing with looters, but something in Omar's description pierced through his caution. The mention of a serpent encircled by waves. They met at dusk, in a narrow alley near the old lighthouse. Omar appeared with a wrapped bundle the size of a large book. When he unwrapped it, Moretti felt the air leave his lungs. The fragment was real, carved from dark basalt, its inscriptions sharp despite years beneath the sea. The waves were stylized, the serpent crowned, and beneath the main symbol, in a primitive form of cuneiform, he recognized words he had only seen in scattered references, the bound one beneath the deep. The world around him seemed to fall away in that moment. The fragment authenticated the very rumors he had spent years chasing. If this piece existed, the tablets were real. And if the tablets were real, then the god they described, the one rewritten out of later mythology, also had once existed in the minds of ancient sailors. Moretti paid for the fragment and returned to his hotel in a state of trembling exhilaration. He stayed awake all night, transcribing, comparing, searching for linguistic parallels. The symbols did not match any known Ugaritic or Biblian system. He hypothesized they belonged to a transitional script, predating the formal alphabetic systems of the Levant. The implications were staggering. This text could represent a lineage of belief older than El, older than Baal, older even than the earliest Sumerian myth cycles. Yet the more he studied the fragment, the more unsettled he became. Some symbols seemed to shift in meaning depending on how long he stared at them. The serpent's eyes appeared to curve subtly, though he knew it was nothing more than the flicker of lamplight. By the third night, he reported hearing a faint sound while analyzing the tablet. Not a voice, not even a word, just a slow pulsing rhythm, like waves breaking behind a closed door. His notes from this period turned erratic. He wrote obsessively about a crown of tides, about a phrase he believed he had deciphered, "The sea remembers." He mentioned a larger set of tablets, possibly 6 or 7 pieces, all describing a pact between the sea and humankind. The fragment he held was merely an introduction, a doorway into something far larger. Then suddenly the entries stopped. Moretti missed a scheduled meeting with a French colleague. Hotel staff recalled that he left the building early on the morning of June 2, 1956, carrying only a satchel and a rolled map. He was seen heading toward the waterfront, and then he vanished. His room was searched days later. Nearly all of his notes were gone. Only a single notebook remained, hidden beneath the mattress, water-stained and warped at the edges as though briefly submerged. Most pages were smudged beyond recovery. But on the last page, written in a trembling hand, was a sketch of the serpent symbol. Beneath it, he had scrawled a sentence in Italian that investigators later translated, "It is not dead. It waits beneath the tide." No trace of Moretti was ever found. No body, no belongings, no explanation. To the public, he became just another disappearance in a period of regional instability. But to the scholars who had followed his work, his vanishing marked the moment when the Leviathan Tablets drifted from obscure rumor into something darker. A mystery tangled in silence, fear, and the deep memory of the sea. And from that point onward, every researcher who dared to pursue the same trail would find Moretti's name waiting for them, like a faint footprint in shifting sand, pointing toward something the world had lost, or had been made to forget. Around the time investigators gave up on locating Dr. Moretti, a thin envelope arrived at the University of Turin, addressed in his handwriting but with no return location. The packet contained only 2 items: a torn page from one of his missing notebooks and a small parchment sheet bearing a hastily penciled drawing. The torn page revealed nothing decipherable: waterlogged ink, distorted symbols, ruins of meaning. But the loose sheet, the drawing, was intact. It showed a serpent coiled into a perfect loop, its body forming a circle with its tail brushing its crowned head. Above the loop, Moretti had added 3 small wave-like arcs. Beneath it, a single phrase, "The serpent crown." For weeks the drawing hovered between departments, passed from epigraphers to cultural historians to religious scholars. Some shrugged it off as the last feverish sketch of a man who had become deeply unstable in his final days. Others immediately recognized echoes of ancient motifs. But none could provide a definitive origin. The symbol was familiar and alien at the same time, something that felt like it should belong to established mythology, yet refused to fit neatly anywhere. The serpent itself resembled Latin, the 7-headed sea dragon defeated by Baal in Ugaritic lore. But Latin was multi-headed, chaotic, a symbol of primordial disorder. Moretti's serpent had only 1 head, and it was not chaotic. It was regal, calm, crowned. This alone broke the pattern of established Near Eastern iconography, where serpents were almost always depicted as enemies to be slain, not sovereigns to be obeyed. A few scholars made connections to Daniel, the semi-mythic hero king from the epics of Daniel. But again, the imagery was off. No crown of waves, no circular serpent. Others suggested a link to Egyptian symbols, perhaps a cousin of the Ouroboros. But the Ouroboros was a serpent eating its own tail, symbolizing cyclical rebirth, whereas here the serpent did not devour itself. It simply formed a perfect ring, as if encircling something sacred or forbidden. The crown perplexed everyone. It was not a typical royal crown. The tips resembled ocean swells, stylized waves sculpted into a 3-point crest. In Phoenician iconography, something similar appeared only in association with deities connected to storms or the sea, particularly Baal-Hadad or Yam. But this crown was not above a human figure. It sat upon the head of the serpent. No known god in the region was depicted this way. It was a theological anomaly. The more scholars studied it, the more Moretti's drawing raised unsettling conclusions. If this crown was symbolic, it indicated a deity of immense authority, not merely another chaotic sea beast, but a god whose sovereignty was drawn from the ocean itself, a god crowned by the sea, not above it. Then came the pattern no one could ignore. When comparing the waves above the serpent's head to maritime cult inscriptions from Byblos and Arwood, researchers noted striking similarities to symbols linked to the priests of the deep, a shadowy sect referenced only in passing by classical authors. These priests allegedly performed trance rituals inside coastal caves, claiming to receive visions from a voice beneath the tide. Greek writers mocked them as delusional, but Phoenician records hinted at an older tradition they inherited, one already declining even before the rise of Carthage. Fragments from a 9th century BCE stele excavated near Sidon contained a nearly erased symbol, a crowned serpent curling around a stylized boat. When cleaned and digitally enhanced decades later, the resemblance to Moretti's drawing was unmistakable. It appeared the symbol had existed once, but had been deliberately chiseled away, leaving only faint traces beneath centuries of erosion. The serpent crown symbol turned up again in a surprising place, on a bronze pendant from Cyprus, dated roughly to 1200 BCE. The pendant depicted a ship with a serpentine shape lurking beneath it. A crown-shaped crest appeared above the creature's head. The artifact had been dismissed as an abstract representation of a storm deity, but in the light of Moretti's sketch, its significance changed. Piece by piece, a disturbing possibility emerged. This symbol had once been widespread along the Mediterranean coast, from Sidon to Cyprus to Byblos, but every identifiable example showed signs of intentional defacement. Scratched out lines, hammer marks, grinding abrasions. Someone, at some point in antiquity, had made a coordinated effort to erase the serpent from the historical record. Why? Because it represented a deity who no longer fit the official narrative. The shift became clearer when examining early Canaanite inscriptions. Texts referring to the Great Serpent of the Deep appear in Proto-Canaanite fragments from the Middle Bronze Age. Yet by the Late Bronze Age, similar references are reinterpreted. The serpent becomes a monster, an enemy, an embodiment of chaos to be destroyed. The transformation coincides with increasing centralization of religious power, suggesting that older, decentralized sea cults were being stamped out. In the context of this evolution, the serpent crown symbol may represent a theological smoking gun, a visual trace of a god whose worship was systematically wiped out, not through natural decline, but deliberate suppression. A deity whose teachings or rituals posed a threat to rising political or religious systems. Something powerful enough that later cultures didn't merely forget it. They actively erased it. At the heart of this erasure lies the coiling loop, the perfect circle. Serpent circles rarely appear in Levantine symbology. Their presence usually indicates eternity, boundary, or containment. When combined with the wave crown, the meaning becomes sharper. Sovereignty over the endlessness of the sea. If Moretti's drawing was accurate, this serpent was not a monster of chaos. It was a god of cycles, knowledge, and the abyss, a ruler of the sea's hidden order. And then a troubling observation emerged, whispered among researchers who dared to think beyond orthodox mythological frameworks. The serpent did not seem to symbolize the sea. It seemed to symbolize something within the sea, something crowned, something conscious, something ancient. The more historians dug into this motif, the more they realized it fit nowhere, yet echoed everywhere. A shadow cast across millennia, showing up in distant corners of temples, ships, amulets, and half-erased frescoes. Moretti had not misidentified a symbol. He had rediscovered one that had been buried intentionally. And now that it had resurfaced, it demanded an answer to the question that had haunted him. The question he had scribbled beside the crowned serpent with a trembling hand. If they erased this god, what was it they feared? The story of the Leviathan does not begin in the Bible, nor in the later Canaanite poems carved into Ugaritic clay. It does not even begin with the Phoenicians, those tireless sailors who mapped the currents of the Mediterranean by instinct alone. Its roots sink far deeper, into the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia, where humans first attempted to understand the chaotic world around them. And at the heart of these early attempts stood a single repeating image, a vast serpent rising from the deep. Long before the Hebrews wrote of a monstrous Leviathan, the Sumerians told stories of Tiamat, the primordial sea, mother of everything, yet also a force that terrified even the gods she birthed. Tiamat was not simply the ocean as we imagine it. She was the boundless, unknowable darkness beneath creation. Clay tablets from over 4,000 years ago depict her not as a gentle mother goddess, but as a serpentine dragon whose roar shook mountains and whose breath birthed storms. Her conflict with Marduk became the foundation of Babylonian cosmology. Order triumphing over chaos, civilization emerging from the sea's wild womb. But buried inside the Enuma Elish, beneath the triumphant narrative of Marduk's victory, lies a quieter, stranger idea. Before Tiamat became an enemy, she was a teacher. The earliest fragments portray her speaking the first laws of the world into existence. Her waters carried knowledge. Her currents whispered secrets to the earliest beings. Later scribes revised these stories, painting her as a monstrous threat that had to be slain. But the older myths linger beneath the edits, revealing a serpent whose domain was not destruction, but understanding. Dig deeper still, and you encounter Labu, a Mesopotamian sea serpent described as a creature who rises when the world forgets the deep. Texts referencing Labu depict him not merely as a beast, but as a cosmic mirror, a being whose emergence signaled that humanity had broken some ancient pact with the sea. Scholars long assumed Labu was simply another version of Tiamat, but newer interpretations suggest something more troubling. Labu was described as speaking, not roaring, speaking, offering warnings, demanding remembrance. Even older Sumerian texts hint at subterranean oceans beneath the earth. The Apsu, a cosmic reservoir from which wisdom and life flowed. The beings connected to the Apsu were often serpentine, depicted with curling bodies and crowned heads, as if ruling over a hidden underwater kingdom. These figures were not demons or foes. They were custodians of the deep, guides, bearers of forbidden knowledge. Across centuries, patterns emerged. Whenever a serpent rose from the deep in Mesopotamian myth, it carried knowledge with it, knowledge that often challenged the authority of reigning gods or kings. And each time, the story ended the same way. The serpent dethroned, rewritten, cast as a villain. The victor became a hero. The serpent became a threat that had to be destroyed. This cycle repeated across cultures. In ancient Syrian texts, a figure called the Devourer of Waves appears as a being who teaches through terror, offering visions to those who dared enter sea caves. Not a monster, a mentor with methods too frightening for later civilizations to tolerate. In these texts, the sea god is described as coiled, crowned, and ancient beyond comprehension. Sailors believed he could grant foresight, but that such gifts demanded a price, one that involved memory, identity, or sanity. The echoes extended even into regions far beyond Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley civilization carved imagery of naga-like serpents coiled beneath rivers and wells, believed to protect sacred waters and the knowledge hidden within them. The Greeks, too, retained faint memories. Cetus, Echidna, and even Okeanos carried attributes suspiciously close to the crowned serpent of the Levant. But these figures were fractioned, diluted by centuries of reinterpretation. The consistent thread, however, remained unmistakable. The serpent was not originally a villain. It was a keeper of mysteries. It was a bearer of truths humans were not ready to hold. What makes this especially compelling is that the earliest serpent myths do not place these beings on land or in the heavens, but beneath the water, in places unreachable, unknowable, and frighteningly silent. The deep has always been humanity's most mysterious frontier. Before telescopes revealed galaxies, before maps charted continents, the ocean was the abyss. It hid worlds no one could imagine. And so it became the natural home for gods who were older, stranger, and harder to control than their skybound counterparts. And then comes the most chilling overlap of all, a detail that appears in broken Sumerian tablets, in Akkadian fragments, in Ugaritic scriptures, and in Phoenician shoreline carvings. The serpent teaches by entering dreams. In some myths, sailors who slept too close to the shoreline during storm tides were said to receive visions, not nightmares but revelations. Ancient priests described these dreams as voices rising through water, bringing knowledge that felt both enlightening and unbearable. One Ugaritic fragment states bluntly, "In the abyss, the serpent whispers the truth of beginnings." This idea, a sentient, ancient being communicating through the sea and through dreams, is older than written history. And it matches exactly what researchers like Moretti believed the Leviathan Tablets described. Not a beast, not a symbol, but a god whose power lay in what it revealed to humankind. But as the centuries passed, these beings of knowledge became recast as threats. Their gifts, wisdom, foresight, secrets, became framed as temptations. The same cultures that once revered the deep eventually came to fear it. And the serpent, once a crowned teacher, became the embodiment of chaos. Why? The answer lies in power. A god that brings knowledge is a god that threatens existing authority. A serpent that grants understanding cannot be controlled. And so these myths were rewritten, layer by layer, until only fragments of the original truth survived. Yet the ancient stories still whisper beneath those revisions, half erased, half preserved, waiting to be noticed again. For anyone willing to listen closely, they reveal a haunting truth. The Leviathan did not enter history as a monster. It was made into one. And somewhere in those early myths, beneath the layers of fear and propaganda, lies the original identity of the crowned serpent. A forgotten deity of the deep, a being the ancients once turned to for guidance. A force perhaps too immense, too alien, too honest for later civilizations to permit. If the Leviathan Tablets truly existed, they might contain the earliest and clearest depiction of this forgotten god, not as an enemy, but as a presence that shaped humanity's first understanding of the sea. A presence the ancient world tried to remember. A presence later empires tried to erase. A presence the waves may still remember, hidden beneath the tides, waiting for someone to rediscover the truth buried in the oldest stories of all. The destruction of Ugarit was so sudden, so complete, that for centuries historians could only guess at what happened. When archaeologists first uncovered the city's final layers in the early 20th century, they found a civilization frozen in its last, terrified moments. Pottery still on shelves, tablets still drying in kilns, letters on desks unfinished. It was as if time had been shattered in an instant. The walls bore scorch marks. Roofs had collapsed inward. Arrowheads lay scattered across courtyards and thresholds. But it was what the scribes left behind that would haunt researchers for decades. Ugarit had been a thriving port city, a bustling hub where Phoenician merchants, Egyptian emissaries, Hittite envoys, Mycenaean sailors, and scribes from every corner of the Bronze Age crossed paths. It was a place defined by trade and ideas, where myths merged and evolved, where stories of gods and storms and oceans flowed like wine in the markets. Yet on one catastrophic night around 1190 BCE, everything ended. The final tablets, found near a ruined administrative building, were written in frantic, uneven strokes. Scribes had clearly been rushing, aware that the city was collapsing around them. Some of the tablets spoke of enemy ships, like smoke on the horizon. Others mentioned tremors beneath the earth, as if something had stirred in the sea. And then there were those that did not speak of war at all, tablets referencing rituals, sacrifices, and a fear deeper than any invading army. One tablet in particular stands out. Discovered crushed beneath a fallen beam, it records the last entry of an unnamed priest, likely stationed near the temple complex. After the typical notations of celestial observations, the text shifts abruptly. The handwriting changes. The lines become jagged, uneven. The scribe writes of the sea rising with no wind, of a voice beneath the waters, and of a ritual that must be performed not at the temple, but at the shoreline. The final line, half broken, half burned, reads, "If the walls fall, we must bind the Leviathan once more." This sentence has baffled scholars. It suggests an old ritual, something preserved in the oral traditions of priests long after official religion had moved on. It hints at a knowledge the scribes did not share with the public, a belief that the sea itself held a force that needed to be restrained, pacified, or appeased during times of crisis. It also implies that Ugarit's elite were aware of something ancient beneath the waves, something that might awaken when the city was vulnerable. Next to this tablet, another was found, a fragment partially melted by intense heat. It contains references to a crown of waves, a phrase that appears nowhere else in known Ugaritic literature. The surviving lines say, "He coils beneath the deep, his crown is of waters. When he stirs, the world breaks." Many dismissed this as poetic metaphor, but others, especially those who studied pre-Canaanite mythology, saw it as evidence of a belief system older than the popular Baal cycle, a belief in a sovereign sea serpent, a god who existed before the pantheon's formal structure. As archaeologists sifted through the ashes of Ugarit, they uncovered something even more unsettling: signs of a sudden, forced suppression of older cults. In rooms near the temple storage pits, they found smashed idols depicting serpentine figures. Not the chaotic Latin of later myths, but a calm, coiled serpent with a crest above its head, eerily similar to the symbol Moretti would rediscover thousands of years later. Many of these idols had been deliberately shattered, as if by order, not by accident. Their fragments were shoved into corners, buried beneath newer artifacts, or left at the bottom of storage pits. Whatever story they once told had been intentionally erased. But in Ugarit, nothing stayed buried for long. As the final days of the city approached, an earthquake struck, or so the geological evidence suggests. Layers of sediment shift abruptly in the archaeological record, indicating a tremor strong enough to fracture walls and open gaps in the earth. These fissures might explain why some parts of the lower city appear flooded and why saltwater residues seep into rooms far inland. Whether the earthquake caused the flood, or the flood came first, remains debated. But the presence of seawater deep inside certain chambers suggests something violent and unnatural. In one submerged chamber, archaeologists discovered a series of carved marks along the walls, curves, spirals, and interlocking arcs. At first, they were mistaken for decorative patterns. Later analysis revealed they corresponded to wave symbols used in ancient maritime rituals. But what made them extraordinary was their arrangement. They formed a circle, surrounding a larger carving at the chamber's center, a faint depiction of a crowned serpent. The waves, the arcs, even the orientation of the room itself pointed toward the sea. This chamber had likely been a ritual site dedicated to a forgotten water deity long before Ugarit adopted its later religious identity. The city's final fire baked the clay tablets inside this chamber, preserving them in a way nature rarely allows. Several contained warnings about the forgotten pact and references to the abyss that hungers when the land forgets. These lines echo similar phrases found in older Mesopotamian myths, suggesting a shared origin. The belief that the sea possessed a form of memory, and that humanity owed it something ancient and binding. The most chilling discovery came from a tablet found near the palace. It recorded a conversation between two officials before the city's fall. One line, nearly rubbed away, reads, "The priests have fled to the shore. They say the Ancient One moves. They say the deep remembers." The official responding dismisses it as superstition. But the fear embedded in the writing is palpable, a sense that something was happening beyond human warfare, something deeper, something older. When Ugarit fell, it did so with scarcely a trace left to explain its destruction. To this day, scholars debate whether it was invaders, natural disaster, or something else. But the final tablets paint a different picture. A city terrified not only of foreign armies, but of the sea itself. A city whose priests rushed toward the shoreline in its last moments, not away from it. A city whose myths spoke of binding a serpent god when the world teetered on the edge of chaos. If the Leviathan Tablets ever existed, Ugarit may have been one of the last cities to preserve even fragments of the older tradition they belonged to. And on the night its walls burned, its scribes left behind their final message. A plea, a ritual, a warning, carved in clay as the world they knew collapsed around them. For when Ugarit died, it did not die silently. It died believing that something in the sea had awakened. The deeper scholars dug into the mythology of the ancient Near East, the clearer one truth became: the Leviathan did not belong to one culture alone. It migrated across centuries like a shadow, changing shape with each civilization that adopted, and sometimes feared, it. Yet beneath all these variations lay a disturbing consistency. The serpent was always there. The sea was always there. And the rewriting, the transformation from teacher to enemy, happened everywhere, as if coordinated by history itself. In the early Hebrew texts, the creature called Leviathan appears as a monstrous serpent, a writhing embodiment of chaos. In the Book of Job, it is unkillable, untamable, immune to the weapons of men. Psalms describes God shattering it. Isaiah speaks of the swift, fleeing serpent slayed on the day of the Lord. But hidden in these verses is an older idea inherited from Canaanite tradition. The idea that Leviathan was not merely a monster, but a cosmic force, something so ancient and immense that only divine intervention could contain it. Yet even in the Hebrew tradition you find strange inconsistencies. In some passages, Leviathan is a singular being, the sea serpent of creation. In others, there are multiple Leviathans, as if scribes were trying to reconcile different traditions into one canon. One particularly enigmatic reference describes Leviathan as a creature made to play in the sea, implying a benevolence or at least a neutrality that contradicts later depictions. These contradictions hint at something older, a story fractured over time, a myth that had already been reshaped before scribes set it down. Compare this with the Canaanite myths, particularly the Baal cycle recovered from Ugarit. In those stories, the sea god Yam commands a monstrous serpent named Latan, a seven-headed dragon. Baal defeats Latan in a cosmic battle that symbolizes order triumphing over chaos. But when scholars examined the stylistic layers of these texts, they noticed something odd. The earliest fragments were not about Baal defeating Latan. Instead, they suggested a relationship of negotiation, even cooperation, as if Latan was originally a guardian of the sea, later rewritten into a defeated foe to elevate Baal's supremacy. Then there is the mysterious figure of Tannin, another serpent mentioned in Hebrew texts. Sometimes Tannin is interchangeable with Leviathan. Sometimes they are distinct. Sometimes Tannin is a sea-dwelling dragon, other times a symbol for foreign empires. This inconsistency suggests scribes were dealing with inherited mythic material they didn't fully understand, material that came from older traditions predating Israelite religion. In Greek myth, the echoes of Leviathan appear yet again. The creature known as Cetus, the monstrous sea serpent sent by Poseidon to ravage coastal cities, resembles Leviathan, but not completely. Cetus is a monster to be slain by heroes like Perseus. But Greek texts also describe Echidna, half-woman, half-serpent, mother of legendary beasts. Hesiod writes cryptically of serpents that guard ancient wisdom beneath the sea, knowledge forbidden to mortals. Some scholars argue these Greek serpents are watered-down versions of a much older symbol carried westward by Phoenician sailors. The Phoenicians, those masters of the sea, worshipped deities now lost to time. Some inscriptions reference Tunanu, a serpent associated with the depths. Others mention a crowned coil, or serpent of the outer sea. Many of these references were scratched out, overwritten, or merged with later myths as Phoenician religion evolved under the influence of neighboring empires. But the remnants form a pattern. Across all these cultures, serpents were initially connected to knowledge, the sea, and cycles of creation and destruction. And then a shift occurred, a seismic cultural rewriting. Serpents that once represented power, wisdom, and guardianship became transformed into symbols of chaos, evil, and destruction. In mythology after mythology, the ancient sea serpent motif was reinterpreted to legitimize new gods, new kings, new orders. A god of storms defeats the serpent. A sky deity slays the dragon. A warrior king vanquishes the sea beast, symbolically conquering nature itself. This is not mythology evolving naturally. This is propaganda. This is ideology overriding older beliefs. Every time a new religious system took root in the ancient Near East, it inherited older myths and reshaped them. Serpents, associated with the sea, unpredictable, uncontrollable, indifferent to human order, became the primary targets of this rewriting. A crowned serpent, a deity commanding the abyss, represented something dangerous to centralized power, a god who answered only to the deep, not to temples or priests, a god that could not be controlled. Even the language betrays the transformation. In older texts, Words associated with the serpent deity are neutral or even reverent. In later texts, those same words become pejorative. Terms once linked to wisdom or dream visions become associated with madness. The sea shifts from being a source of life and knowledge to a symbol of danger and moral corruption. What unsettled scholars most was the pattern emerging across time. The older the text, the more positive the serpent. The newer the text, the more monstrous it becomes. This universal shift implies an orchestrated cultural suppression, not accidental but systematic. One theory suggests that as land-based empires grew, sea-centric beliefs threatened their theological control. Coastal religions that revolved around tides, storms, and the mysteries of the deep had to be neutralized. Their gods of currents, dream visions, and the unknown had to be demonized or erased. The final puzzle piece came when researchers compared the serpent crown symbolism across cultures. Whether in Ugaritic carvings, Phoenician pottery, or whispers preserved in later Greek traditions, the crowned serpent consistently represented not chaos, but sovereignty, a ruler of the sea, not a threat to it. This realization reframed everything. The Leviathan was never meant to be a monster. It was made into one because the older version of the serpent god did not fit the emerging religious narrative. A narrative that demanded order, hierarchy, and strict control over the symbols of nature. When these myths were rewritten, the serpent's divinity was stripped away. Its crown became a threat. Its knowledge became taboo. Its ancient role, guardian, teacher, ruler of the deep, was buried under layers of heroic epics and divine conquests. And yet, the oldest stories refuse to vanish completely. They survive in half-burned tablets, misinterpreted sculptures, corrupted verses, and the faint echoes carried along the trade routes of the ancient Mediterranean. They hint at a truth that later civilizations desperately tried to bury. Before Leviathan was a monster, it was a god. A god older than Baal, older than Yahweh's scribes, older than the storm gods who tried to claim the sky. A god of the deep, crowned, coiled, and remembering. And if this ancient serpent was rewritten once, how many other truths about the primordial sea were rewritten with it? How many warnings were disguised as myths? How many teachings were masked as battles? The closer scholars look, the clearer the pattern becomes, and the more troubling the implications. Because if every culture felt compelled to rewrite the sea serpent, then every culture feared the same thing. They were never meant to be remembered. In the grand narratives written by priests of Baal, by scribes of Yahweh, by chroniclers loyal to kings and conquerors, these figures appear only in the margins, hinted at, distorted, ridiculed. The maritime priesthoods of the ancient Levant existed like a shadow beneath official religion. Tolerated in times of peace, whispered about in times of famine or drought, and swiftly eradicated whenever a new religious order needed ideological purity. And yet, their traces remain. Not in polished temples or monumental inscriptions, but in the places where the land meets the water, in sea caves, ritual pits, half-collapsed altars carved into cliff faces overlooking the Mediterranean. Archaeologists who have explored the coastlines of Sidon, Tyre, Byblos, and Arwood have found symbols that do not match the dominant pantheons. Spirals, concentric waves, serpent crests, and carved channels designed to funnel seawater into ceremonial basins. These are not the trappings of Baal or Dagon. They belong to another tradition entirely, one much older and far stranger. Ancient Greek travelers wrote vague accounts of coastal water diviners, who claimed to hear voices from the sea. Hittite merchants recorded stories of tide speakers, who could predict storms not by the wind, but by listening to vibrations in cave walls. A fragment of the Egyptian Amarna letters mentions priests in Byblos who consult the deep, whose god is not spoken. Each reference is maddeningly brief, but together they sketch the outline of a forgotten caste. The priests of the deep, or as some Phoenician inscriptions call them, the wave-talkers. Unlike temple priests who operated in cities, this sect lived along the rugged edges of the coastline. They preferred isolation, caves reachable only at low tide, hidden grottos, stone ledges carved by centuries of waves. Their rituals involved the rhythmic chanting of syllables designed to mimic the crashing of surf. They used long, curved horns that produced a low hum echoing the resonance of underwater currents. Their ceremonies were nocturnal, timed with the lunar cycle. And most strikingly, they practiced dream invocation, lying on cold stone slabs near tidal pools, allowing the rising waters to brush their skin as they entered trance-like states. This was not ordinary worship. This was communion. One of the few intact ritual tablets recovered near Tyre describes a ceremony called the listening. Participants would sit in complete darkness, deep within a sea cave, while priests recited verses that invoked the one who dwells beneath. As the tide rose, the chamber would fill with the sound of water surging through narrow tunnels. The initiates were instructed to empty their minds, to let the deep speak through vibration and breath. Some poems describe visions, swirling lights, serpentine shapes, or a crowned coil approaching from the depths of the subconscious. To later monotheistic scribes, this practice was little more than dangerous superstition. To the wave talkers, it was the oldest and most sacred form of communication, a way to access a layer of the world hidden from ordinary sight. But the secrecy of this priesthood may not have been entirely voluntary. Examining layers of strata around these coastal ritual sites, archaeologists discovered abrupt changes. Symbols scratched out, shrines dismantled, altars smashed as if by deliberate human intervention. These destructions are not random. They appear clustered around the same centuries when centralized temple systems, those controlled by kings and upper castes, were rising in power. The new elite had no room for unregulated spiritual authorities living outside the political structure. A priesthood that answered not to monarchs but to the sea itself posed an existential threat. And so, the wave cults vanished, but not without resistance. One of the most disturbing finds came from a submerged cave near Byblos. Divers discovered an altar room where dozens of small clay figurines were arranged in a circle. Each figurine represented a human figure kneeling, head bowed. But in the center of the circle lay a single idol, a crowned serpent coiled around a sphere. Its surface had been intentionally defaced, cracked by repeated hammer strikes. Beside it, etched into the floor, was a nearly erased inscription. "We kept the pact until they broke it." Another cave near Sidon contained engraved warnings. "The deep will remember, and when the land forgets the sea will rise." These phrases echo the myths Moretti studied, myths in which the sea is not simply a realm but a conscious force. If these priests believed the sea possessed memory, the destruction of their cult would not merely be a political act. It would be a violation of a sacred covenant, one that might carry consequences far greater than historical silence. Classical authors mention this priesthood only indirectly, often mocking them as madmen who claimed that the ocean whispered secrets. Pliny the Elder wrote dismissively about coastal soothsayers who professed to dream the speech of waves, suggesting they predicted storms through hallucinations. But even his condescension contains a sliver of truth. These priests were known for their uncanny accuracy in forecasting tidal shifts and seasonal storms. Some modern scholars suspect they were early oceanographers, reading patterns in the sea long before science had names for them. But the more troubling possibility is that the accuracy of their predictions came from something else, something closer to what ancient myths whispered: communion, not observation. What emerged from this research was a picture of a priesthood deeply tied to a god now erased from history. They worshipped not Baal, not Dagon, not Yam, but a deeper being, one associated with serpentine imagery, dream visions, and the memory of the sea. This being was not portrayed as chaotic. It was depicted as a ruler, a judge, a watcher. The priesthood claims, scattered across eroded carvings, evoke a duality. The sea gives knowledge, but it also demands respect. To abandon the pact was to invite disaster. And then, around the end of the Bronze Age, these priesthoods disappear almost entirely from the record. Their caves are sealed, their inscriptions scratched away, their idols smashed. Their symbols, especially the crowned serpent, are systematically removed. This is not the result of a slow cultural shift. It is a purge. Later religious authorities replaced these sea cults with narratives of storm gods defeating sea serpents. The message was clear. The deep must not be worshipped, it must be conquered. And yet, through all this erasure, one belief refused to die: that something beneath the ocean had once spoken to humankind. a being whose teachings later civilizations wanted forgotten. A voice the wave priests tried desperately to preserve. A presence the sea, in its endless memory, might still carry, waiting for someone who remembers how to listen. Rome liked to imagine itself as a beacon of order, a civilizing force marching across the world with law, architecture, and structured religion. But beneath this polished exterior lay a brutal truth. Anything that resisted assimilation, anything that operated outside Rome's political or spiritual control, was crushed. And when the Romans reached the Phoenician coastlines, they found something that unsettled them more than foreign armies or hostile tribes. A network of ancient maritime cults whose loyalties lay not with kings, not with priests, but with the sea itself. To Roman governors, these cults were not merely strange. They were dangerous. Reports written by early provincial administrators describe gatherings in sea caves, night rituals illuminated by torches reflected in tidal pools, chants resonating from cliffside chambers. One report, written by an officer stationed near Berytus, describes a procession of robed figures who entered the surf in silence and vanished into the dark. Another mentions symbols of serpents crowned by waves, interpreted as signs of a subversive religion outside the approved pantheon of the empire. Rome tolerated many foreign gods: Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, as long as their priesthoods cooperated with imperial authority. But the wave cults were different. They were secretive, decentralized, and deeply tied to landscape features that could not be regulated. Caves, coves, hidden beaches. Worse still, the cults taught that the sea possessed its own will, not as a metaphor, but as a literal, conscious force that could not be commanded by emperors or generals. This idea alone was heretical to Roman ideology, which viewed the natural world as something to dominate, just as Rome dominated nations. And so the crackdown began. Early imperial records mention an order issued under the reign of Augustus concerning unauthorized coastal rights. While vague on details, archaeologists now believe this edict targeted the surviving maritime priesthoods. Similar decrees resurfaced under Tiberius and later under Vespasian, each more forceful than the last. Along with these orders came reports of confiscated artifacts: stone tablets, serpent figurines, ritual horns, and carved wave crests. The troubling part? Almost none of these items survive. Museum inventories from the Roman period list objects taken from coastal sanctuaries. But when modern historians attempted to trace these artifacts, they found they had vanished from the record centuries ago. The few that remain appear only as descriptions in Roman catalogs, often accompanied by notes like "object of no cultural significance destroyed" or "item melted down." Some were likely destroyed intentionally as part of religious purges. Others may have been hidden or stolen by collectors intrigued by forbidden cults. One letter written by a Roman procurator to the governor of Syria reveals just how seriously the empire took these cults. He warns that the priests had ways of stirring the minds of the people, claiming their rituals involved visions, trances, and the summoning of voices from the sea. He describes them as too persuasive, too unpredictable, and too old. The letter ends with a chilling line: "They speak a language older than our gods." Rome did not tolerate gods older than Rome. Archaeological evidence supports the historical accounts of a purge. Near Tyre, a sea cave shrine shows signs of violent destruction. Broken altars, scattered offerings, and carvings of crowned serpents chipped away with iron tools. In a grotto near Sidon, the walls display hurried scratches, as if someone attempted to erase symbols before soldiers arrived. In another cave further north, divers discovered a cluster of bronze tablets deliberately submerged beneath slabs of collapsed rock, possibly hidden during the crackdown but never retrieved. One fragment recovered from that site contains a broken inscription that reads, "The deep cannot be forgotten, but men may forget their place." As Roman influence expanded, surviving members of the priesthood seemed to scatter into smaller, more isolated groups. Some fled north toward Cyprus. Others retreated deeper into cave networks inaccessible except at low tide. A few, according to late classical authors, traveled westward along Phoenician trade routes, taking their knowledge with them. But wherever they went, the pattern was the same: Secrecy, silence, disappearance. By the 2nd century CE, the cults had almost entirely vanished from written sources. What had once been a widespread coastal tradition dissolved into fragmented folklore. Stories of serpent gods beneath the waves, warnings about breaking ancient pacts, whispers of the sea that remembers. These tales lingered among fishermen and sailors long after the priesthoods themselves were gone. But without the rituals, without the teachings, their meanings were reduced to superstition. Yet some clues survived within Rome's own bureaucracy. A set of confiscation logs discovered in the archives of Antioch lists 7 tablets of black stone, seized from a group of illegal coast priests near Arwood. These tablets were described as engraved with serpents and wave marks. The officer noted that scholars began to study them, but soon demanded they be placed under religious review due to subject matter contrary to the Roman order of the cosmos. After that, the logs fall silent. What happened to those 7 tablets? Were they destroyed? Hidden? Stolen? No one knows. But centuries later, whispers of a set of forbidden sea tablets resurfaced, in medieval sailor tales, in Renaissance occult manuscripts, and ultimately in the scattered academic rumors that reached Dr. Elias Moretti in the 1950s. The Roman purges did not just silence a priesthood. They fractured a legacy, a lineage of knowledge passed down since the earliest civilizations, a belief system centered not on fear, but on respect for the deep. A worldview in which the sea was not merely a border or a resource, but a conscious, ancient presence with which humanity had struck a pact. By stamping out the maritime cults, Rome may have destroyed the last custodians of a story older than recorded history. A story the crowned serpent once taught. A story the Leviathan Tablets may have recorded before they vanished. And if Rome fought so fiercely to erase them, the question becomes unavoidable. What truth did the empire fear these sea cults might reveal? He was not a priest nor a scholar, nor a man with any interest in myths or forgotten gods. He was a navigator, a Phoenician sailor named Hanno of Tyre, born into a family of merchants whose lives were tied to the tides. His story would have been lost completely had a single fragmented account not survived. A brittle parchment copied and recopied over centuries by scribes who could not decide whether it was a sailor's tale or a sacred warning. Hanno lived around the 8th century BCE, during the height of Phoenician maritime expansion. He commanded a small merchant galley that traveled between Tyre, Cyprus, Carthage, and occasionally as far west as the Pillars of Hercules. His crew respected him not for bravery or ferocity, but for something more valuable, intuition. According to the fragment, he read the sea as others read letters, sensing storms before they formed, detecting currents no other sailor noticed, adjusting course by instincts that seemed almost supernatural. Some said he had inherited this gift from his mother, who, according to rumor, was descended from one of the old wave priest families long suppressed by the cities. In the fragment, his story begins on a night when the sea itself seemed to turn against him. The voyage had started like any other, a shipment of cedar planks and dyed textiles bound for Cyprus. The winds were in their favor, the sky clear, but 3 days out, the horizon shifted. Not slowly, as storms usually did, but abruptly. A bank of clouds rose like a wall, dark and unnatural, swallowing the sunset in minutes. The crew scrambled to adjust the sails, but the winds changed too quickly, whipping from calm breezes to violent gusts that tore across the deck like claws. Hanno ordered the mast lowered. Even then, the waves slammed into the hull with such force that several men were thrown to their knees. The storm did not sound like any they had encountered. There was no thunder, no lightning, only a deep, rhythmic pounding as if something massive was beating against the underside of the sea. According to the surviving text, the sailors began to panic. They whispered that the old gods were angry, that a forgotten spirit had awakened. Hanno insisted they maintain control, but he too felt the unnatural pulse beneath the waves. It was not the chaotic turbulence of a storm. It was steady, measured, intentional. The sea began to rise, not in towering crests, but in a swelling dome of water that lifted the ship upward like a toy. The crew clung to ropes, shouting prayers to Baal and Yam. But the prayers evaporated when they saw it. Something colossal moved beneath the surface. Not the flicker of a fish, not the shadow of a whale, something coiled, something crowned. The fragment describes it only in metaphor, comparing it to a mountain stirring, a serpent of impossible length, and a crest of waves that bowed like a king's diadem. Hanno himself struggled to document what he saw, writing, "It did not move as a beast moves. It moved as a thought moves. Then the sea opened its mouth. A vortex formed, a broad, slow-spinning column of water that did not behave like a whirlpool but like a deliberate gesture, as though the sea itself were inhaling. The ship was dragged toward it. The crew screamed, some falling to the deck in terror. Hanno, fighting the pull, clung to the rail as the water rose in a spiraling pillar. And through that spiraling water he saw something looking back at him. A single eye, massive, unblinking, shining like polished basalt beneath the waves. He later wrote, "It saw me, not as prey, not as nuisance, but as something it knew." He dared not write the rest directly. Instead, he recorded symbols, sketches of waves, a serpent loop, and a crown. Only at the bottom of the page did he whisper a phrase that later scribes preserved with shivering reluctance. "The sea is not water, but memory." And then, in larger script, it spoke. The next portion of the fragment is damaged. The words are faint, many lines illegible. But scholars reconstruct certain phrases: voice without sound, felt inside the skull, questions in a tongue older than breath. It appears the being did not communicate through speech, but through something closer to direct thought. Images, emotions, memories pressed into Hanno's mind like seals into wax. He described seeing visions of storms that predated humankind, lands rising from the sea only to sink again, and serpentine shapes coiling through underwater caverns lit by strange bioluminescence. He felt a presence far older than the gods worshipped on land, a consciousness vast as the ocean itself, not hostile, not benevolent, simply aware. Then came the moment that changed everything. The storm vanished, not gradually, instantly, as if dismissed by the creature's withdrawal. The sea flattened, the air grew still, the stars reappeared overhead. Hanno found himself gripping the railing, trembling, while his crew stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. They claimed he had been whispering in a language unknown to them. They claimed he had stood still while waves crashed around him, untouched by water. Some insisted they saw a pale glow around him, like reflected moonlight. He ordered them to set course for land. But they refused. They demanded he explain what he had seen. Hanno offered no answers, not because he wished to hide the truth, but because he could not articulate what had entered his mind. The crew, believing him marked by something from the deep, stripped him of command and forced him into the hold, afraid he might summon the storm again. The ship eventually limped into Sidium harbor. The crew told authorities of a cursed voyage. They were questioned and released, but Hanno disappeared within a week. No charges, no burial, no trace. Only his fragment remained. How it survived is unclear, perhaps smuggled, perhaps preserved by one of his descendants. The earliest copy dates to the 3rd century BCE, written in Greek, likely transcribed by a scribe who did not believe what he was copying. But the symbols, the serpent loop, the crown of waves, match the imagery found in Ugarit, Sidon, Cyprus, and the later sketches by Elias Moretti. Even more unsettling is the repeated phrase in Hanno's account, "The sea is alive," not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. He claimed to have met a being that existed beneath storms, beneath currents, beneath time. A crowned serpent of the deep whose presence could bend weather, manipulate water, and pierce human thought. A being that recognized him. A being that had spoken. A being that, according to the last ruined line of the fragment, left him with a final message: "Do not forget us as others did." For centuries, historians dismissed Hanno's account as sailor's madness, a hallucination brought on by fear, exhaustion, or a violent storm. But those who study the Leviathan Tablets see something else in his words, a parallel, pattern, a confirmation. If Hanno truly encountered what the ancient priesthoods worshipped, then his testimony is the closest thing the modern world has to a first-hand encounter with the deity erased from history. And his warning, the plea not to forget, suggests that humanity once knew the sea as something far more conscious, far more ancient, and far more watchful than we dare imagine. Long before maps carved clean borders across coastlines, long before science reduced oceans to numbers and measurements, ancient civilizations looked upon the sea and felt something humanity has largely forgotten: a presence. Not a metaphor, not an abstraction, a living intelligence. They believed the sea was not simply water, salt, and depth, but a conscious entity that moved, listened, and responded. And when you trace the earliest myths, carvings, and rituals across the Near East, you discover something startling. Nearly every coastal civilization described the ocean the same way, not as a realm, but as a being. In the earliest Egyptian texts, the primordial waters are called Nun, an endless, formless sea that existed before creation. But while modern interpreters label Nun chaos, older inscriptions complicate this. Hymns found in the pyramid texts depict Nun as wise, knowing, a source of cosmic memory from which the gods themselves emerged. One priestly commentary even states, "All things that will be, the waters already remember." This concept, the sea possessing memory, echoes almost perfectly the secret lines from Ugarit, the chants of Phoenician wave priests, and the murmured fragments recovered near Sidon. Meanwhile, in early Byblos, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, archaeologists uncovered ceremonial basins carved to funnel seawater inland. The arrangement of these basins implies that they were not just for purification. They were designed for communication. Inscriptions around them refer to the voice beneath, the deep listener, and the watcher in the waves. These expressions do not describe a storm god or a capricious ocean spirit. They describe a presence within the water, a conscious entity linked to the tides and to human ritual. Mesopotamian myths reinforce this idea through the figure of Apsu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth. Apsu is not simply a physical reservoir, he is sentient. He speaks to the elder gods, plans, remembers, and listens. The texts portray Apsu as a mind, the original mind, sleeping beneath the world. Later editors attempted to reduce him to a mythological archetype, but the older tablets are clear. Apsu is a consciousness made of water. Even more striking is the Sumerian epithet for the deep ocean, the house of knowledge. Scholars long believed this was symbolic, referring to the sea as a source of trade, harvest, and wealth. But certain temple inscriptions use the phrase literally, describing visions received through dreams given by the deep, and rituals designed to hear the world before it was spoken. The sea, to them, was not merely a place. It was an origin, a teacher, a conversation partner. As centuries passed, this belief evolved into more structured mythologies. In Phoenician cosmology, the sea god Yam is not just a tyrant of storms. Older layers of myth depict Yam as a sovereign who commands secrets from the abyss. His priests, the same maritime brotherhood later hunted by Rome, treated the sea as a sentient king whose moods reflected cosmic truths. They believed the ocean could reveal prophecies, shape dreams, and communicate warnings. And then there is the forbidden figure, the Leviathan or Latin or Tunanu, names that shift but always describe something similar. These beings were consistently associated with the deepest parts of the sea, beyond human access. Unlike Yam or Baal, they were not pictured as humanoid. They were serpentine, coiled, crowned, not creatures, but embodiments of the ocean's hidden mind. Some ancient texts, mostly damaged, censored, or relegated to obscure collections, describe the Leviathan's domain as the endless below, not a physical pit or canyon, but a state of the ocean, a layer beneath the known waters where the sea becomes self. This poetic phrasing has long puzzled scholars. But modern marine science has uncovered something eerily similar: vast underwater sound channels capable of transmitting vibrations across entire oceans, deep-sea networks of bioluminescent organisms that pulse together like neural synapses, pressure zones completely cut off from surface influence. To the ancients, these phenomena were not random. They were signs of a mind, a self-aware deep. Multiple Bronze Age tablets describe rituals intended not to summon a god, but to address the sea directly. They speak of calling the remembrance of waters, and speaking to the deep as one speaks to a wise elder. Such rituals were considered dangerous, not because of superstition, but because they involved confronting the ocean's consciousness, something enormous, ancient, and indifferent to human frailty. Later religions erased these ideas, replacing them with simpler, more manageable narratives. The sea became a monster. The serpent became an enemy. The mind of the deep became chaos, a word that strips all meaning and all intelligence from the concept. This was not theological evolution, it was a deliberate simplification, a way to consolidate religious authority and sweep away older, more complicated forms of spirituality. But fragments survived, stubborn as barnacles. A Babylonian charm tablet refers to the wise serpent of the deep who spoke to the first kings. A fragment from Katna mentions a ritual in which initiates descended into the water's thought. Greek myth preserves faint echoes in the legends of Proteus, the ever-shifting sea god who possessed absolute knowledge but shared it only with those who could catch him. Even the Hebrew term Tiham, usually translated as the deep, comes from an older Akkadian word related to Tiamat, carrying the original implication of a sentient abyss. All of these traditions circle the same idea. The sea was not simply alive. It was aware of humanity, aware of the world, aware of things long forgotten. This belief explains the crowned serpent imagery that appears again and again in forbidden contexts. It explains the dream visions described by ancient navigators. It explains the terror of Ugarit's priests as their city fell, rushing toward the shoreline to perform rites meant to bind something the deep might release. And it explains why civilizations sought so fiercely to demonize the idea of an ocean mind. A god that needed no temples, no sacrifices, no priests, only the eternal movement of water itself. To modern ears, these ideas sound poetic at best. But to the ancients, the distinction between myth and experience was not as sharp as ours. They lived at the edge of a vast, unknowable horizon. They saw things, bioluminescent waves, red tides, rogue whirlpools, deep-sea sounds, strange dreams under the influence of crashing surf, that would terrify even us today. And somewhere in this mixture of fear, awe, and intuition, a truth formed. The sea behaves like something that remembers, something that responds, something alive. If the Leviathan Tablets truly existed, they may not have described a monster or even a deity in the traditional sense. They may have described a worldview in which the sea was a conscious participant in human existence, a presence the ancients honored, feared, and ultimately tried to forget. But as the old myths warn, forgetting does not erase. Not when the memory lies in the ocean itself. For decades after Dr. Moretti's disappearance, the legend of the Leviathan Tablets remained little more than an academic rumor. A ghost story traded between exhausted archaeologists at dig sites, something whispered half-jokingly over campfires on windswept shores. But in the late 1970s, the story shifted. It became tangible. It became real again. It began with a crate unremarkable in appearance, seized during a routine smuggling interception near Latakia in 1978. Syrian customs officers, bored, underpaid, and used to confiscating cheap forgeries, opened it expecting stolen pottery or illegal ivory. What they found instead would set off one of the most baffling chains of events in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. Inside the crate lay a collection of artifacts. Bronze weights, chipped amphora fragments, a rusted anchor stone, and at the bottom, wrapped in moldy linen, a slab of dark stone no larger than a dinner tray. It was heavy, unnaturally so. The customs report noted its density was unlike any common basalt or slate, and its surface was engraved with symbols no one present recognized. The officers, uninterested in antiquities, set it aside. But the crate's paperwork contained a cryptic marking, LTHN 4/7. It meant nothing to the officials, but to the academics who eventually heard of it, that label struck like lightning. The rumors had always spoken of 7 tablets. And this one, if the marking was genuine, was number 4. The artifact never made it to a museum. Before any formal classification could occur, a retired Interpol officer named Georges Delacourt intervened. Officially, he was assisting with investigations into smuggling routes. Unofficially, he had spent years tracking patterns of stolen antiquities tied to obscure cultic artifacts. patterns so strange they bordered on myth. When Delacourt examined the tablet, he recognized one symbol instantly: a coiling serpent crowned by stylized waves. The same motif had appeared in 3 separate black market busts he had overseen since the late 1960s, each time attached to items that disappeared before they could be studied. Delacourt tried to alert academic contacts in Paris and Beirut. He sent written notes, mailed photographs, requested geological testing. But within 10 days, every avenue he opened collapsed. A fire destroyed the storage facility housing the artifact. The officer who had logged the crate vanished from his post without explanation. Delacourt's letters to museums went missing in transit. And when he attempted to contact the smuggler arrested in the raid, he found the man had allegedly suffered a fatal accident while in custody. All that remained of the tablet was a single grainy photograph, poorly lit, blurred at the edges, but unmistakably engraved with the crowned serpent. When Delacourt tried to circulate the image among scholars, he found something even stranger. Many refused to discuss it. A few responded cautiously, hinting they recognized the symbol but would not say from where. One professor wrote only, "That mark is older than the pantheons we teach. Do not pursue this." Delacourt did pursue it. His notes, recovered after his death in 1982, detail an increasingly desperate investigation. He traced the crate back to a fishing village north of Tripoli, where, according to locals, a group of divers had recently discovered a submerged stone room off the coast, an underwater structure lined with carvings. The divers had removed several artifacts, hoping to sell them. Most were worthless, except one, the tablet. When Delacourt showed villagers the photograph, a few reacted with visible fear. One man claimed the divers had spoken of hearing voices in the water, a low hum that rose and fell like distant chanting. Another described seeing faint blue light deep inside the submerged chamber. These accounts were dismissed by geologists as mere stories, but the villagers insisted that the structure was not natural, and that older generations had warned them never to fish near that part of the coast. In his final written entry, Delacourt described receiving a message from an anonymous informant who claimed to have handled the tablet before its confiscation. The message contained a detail that chilled him. The carvings were not worn down by the sea. They were as sharp as if made yesterday. That is impossible. Every archaeologist knows how saltwater devours stone. No artifact submerged for centuries, much less millennia, retains crisp, unworn edges. If the tablet was authentic, then something extraordinary had preserved it. Delacourt's notes mention one more lead: a wealthy private collector based in the Gulf, Abdullah Marfani, a name already rumored in black market circles. Marfani was known for his obsession with artifacts connected to ancient water rituals. He allegedly owned Phoenician wave crests, fragments of serpent idols, and several objects believed to be replicas or fakes of the Leviathan Tablets. But the informant insisted that Marfani had once possessed something real, something he guarded more fiercely than anything else in his vault-like collection: a stone slab carved with a crowned serpent. Delacourt's final attempt to reach Marfani failed. He wrote of receiving a warning, untraceable, and signed, "Do not seek the sea god texts. They were hidden for a reason." 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment. Heart failure, officials claimed. His family insisted he had no history of cardiac problems. His notes suggest he believed he was being followed in the days before his death. But the story did not end with him. Around the same time, a smuggled artifact surfaced briefly in Cyprus. A small fragment of black stone featuring 3 wave crests and part of a serpentine curve. A museum worker privately photographed it before it vanished from storage. The symbol matched the one on Delacourt's tablet. And in Beirut, a doctoral student researching Phoenician maritime cults claimed she saw a slate fragment in a private collection that bore the inscription, "The Deep Remembers." She, too, said it disappeared shortly after. Piece by piece, the pattern sharpened. The Leviathan tablets were real enough that someone kept trying to hide them. Artifacts surfaced, then vanished. Photographs circulated, then were discredited or destroyed. Scholars spoke in coded language, referencing the sea texts, the tide inscriptions, or the deep fragments. Every clue looked accidental. But the pattern was deliberate. Something or someone in the modern world did not want these tablets found. Not because they were valuable, not because they were fake, but because of what they might reveal. The crowned serpent, the wave-crest crown, the warnings about memory, the deep and ancient pacts, the resurfacing of even one tablet in even one photograph, threatened to open a door to a forgotten chapter of human history. A chapter that some power, ancient or modern, had worked very hard to keep submerged. And as the fragments multiplied across continents like drifting wreckage from a ship long sunk, one terrifying truth became clear. The tablets were not just lost. They were being kept lost. And the deeper investigators looked, the more the sea seemed to reach back, carrying whispers, warnings, and symbols that refused to stay buried. The mansion did not appear on maps. It had no formal address, no listed property records, no documented architectural plans. Local drivers knew it only as the house above the cliffs, a sprawling stone estate perched on a jagged outcrop overlooking the Mediterranean, shrouded in cypress trees and perpetual mist. Those who worked there, groundskeepers, cooks, temporary security hires, were required to sign lengthy confidentiality contracts before they ever glimpsed the iron gates. And within those gates lived a man whose wealth was whispered about but never fully understood. Abdullah Marfani, collector of rarities, patron of obscure scholars, and keeper of secrets that most historians believed non-existent. Marfani was not a name one encountered in museums or academic journals. He did not endow universities or sponsor archaeological expeditions. Instead, he operated in the shadows of the antiquities world, an enigma known only to those who trafficked in artifacts too strange, too controversial, or too inconvenient for public institutions. His reputation was built on whispers, that he paid exorbitant sums for objects with unclear provenance, that he braved political danger zones to retrieve relics no one else dared pursue, that his vault held forbidden artifacts banned from excavation reports and erased from official inventories. His obsession was not gold, jewels, or royal treasures. It was knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge. And nothing fascinated him more than the sea. Visitors rarely reached the mansion's interior, but those who did spoke of rooms lined with nautical maps dating back millennia, half-rotted scrolls retrieved from shipwrecks, fragments of driftwood engraved with extinct writing systems, and shelves of artifacts bearing symbols no modern scholar had confidently translated. One wing of the house reportedly contained dozens of objects depicting serpents, bronze coils, wave crests carved into stone, stylized crowns shaped like rippling tides. A former curator who briefly consulted for Marfani later confessed that stepping inside the mansion felt like entering a museum built by someone who wanted to resurrect an ancient religion rather than study it. But the most heavily guarded space in the mansion was the vault. Hidden beneath the estate's central courtyard, accessible only by a biometric lock and a key Marfani wore on a chain beneath his clothes, the vault housed his most prized relics. Most employees were forbidden anywhere near it. One former guard described the vault as a cavern of stone and steel, lined with temperature-controlled cases, motion sensors, and artifacts displayed with almost religious reverence. Among these objects was something Marfani referred to only as the sea text. His diaries, discovered years later under circumstances nearly as mysterious as the man himself, described this artifact in unsettling detail. A black stone, heavy as judgment, carved with symbols that breathe. A serpent crowned in waves, older than the gods of the land. The text that speaks not of demons, but of the deep. Whether this was the same tablet confiscated in 1978, another piece from the same set, or something entirely different is unknown. But one thing is certain, Marfani believed he possessed part of the Leviathan Tablets. He often brought in translators, linguists, epigraphers, oceanographers, even neurologists to examine the stone. Most stayed only briefly. Some left abruptly, refusing payment. One disappeared. And one, the translator whose story became the most notorious, suffered what witnesses later described as a complete psychological collapse. His name was Dr. Nadir al-Khatib, an accomplished linguist fluent in multiple extinct Semitic languages. He arrived at the estate confident, skeptical, proud of his reputation for debunking forgeries. In journal entries later discovered in his abandoned apartment, he wrote about the artifact in Marfani's vault. The symbols are wrong, or rather wrong for their time. Too early, too perfect. I should be laughing at this. Instead, I feel watched. He spent 3 nights in the vault, analyzing the tablet under various forms of light. On the 4th day, he emerged pale, shaking, and unable to articulate what he had experienced. House staff recalled him repeating a single phrase, "It looks back." When Marfani approached him, Al-Khatib reportedly shoved the collector away and fled the mansion, leaving behind all his research notes and equipment. He never returned. Weeks later, a fisherman found him wandering the shoreline miles away, barefoot and delirious, muttering fragmented sentences about crowns, coils, and the endless thought beneath the waves. Marfani recorded the incident in his private diary. He saw something in the text, or something in himself saw back through it. The stone contains not words, but a presence. Marfani himself was not untouched. His writings grow increasingly feverish as the years progress. He notes strange dreams, recurring visions of a coiled shape rising through dark water, and the sensation of pressure behind the eyes whenever he studied the tablet for too long. He wrote, "The text hums if one listens, not aloud, behind the skull. It remembers." But the most disturbing entry is dated 2 months before his death. The tablet asks questions. Whether Marfani's mind deteriorated naturally or whether the artifact played some role in his decline remains a matter of speculation. When he died under ambiguous circumstances, officially from a stroke, unofficially from stress, according to those close to him, the vault was sealed. But something inside it went missing. When authorities eventually gained access to the estate, the cases were intact, the catalogs preserved, and most artifacts accounted for. But the stone tablet, the one bearing the crowned serpent, was gone, vanished without a trace. No sign of forced entry, no missing keys, no security alarms triggered. It was simply no longer there. Some believe Marfani destroyed it in his final days. Others believe a family member or trusted assistant removed it to hide its existence forever. And others, those who follow the stranger threads of the legend, believe the tablet was taken back by the same forces that once hid it thousands of years ago. Today, only Marfani's diaries remain, filled with cryptic warnings and sketches of the serpent crown. They provide the clearest insider account of what the Leviathan Tablets might contain and the dangers of uncovering them. But the most unsettling detail appears in a note scrawled in the margin of one of his final entries. "I thought I collected it, but it collected me." For those who still search for the Leviathan Tablets, Marfani's story is a reminder. It is not only ancient civilizations that feared the deep. Modern men with power and money have too, and some of them learned, too late, that the crowned serpent does not remain silent when disturbed. The sheet of paper was small enough to fit in a pocket, thin, jagged along the edges, stained with something no conservator could confidently identify: water, ink, sweat, or something else entirely. It was the last page Dr. Nadir Al-Khatib ever wrote. And every scholar who has seen it agrees on one thing. The man who wrote it was not the same man who had walked into Marfani's vault only 4 days earlier. For years, the page was rumored to be lost, destroyed, or locked away in a private archive. Yet when it finally surfaced, in the estate of a reclusive antiquities dealer who died without heirs, the truth it contained chilled even hardened researchers. There were no coherent paragraphs, no full translations, no academic annotations. Just a desperate scrawl of fragmented lines, slanting downward as though the writer's hand trembled uncontrollably. And across the center of the page, written with such pressure that the pen tore into the paper, were 2 words repeated again and again: "It watches." Around those words spiraled dozens of phrases, written in a deteriorating script that grew smaller and more erratic as it circled inward, like the thoughts of a mind collapsing into itself. Not language, not entirely. "The lines move when I don't look at them. I feel it behind the symbols. The crown is not a crown. A question carved in stone. The sea remembers. The deep dreams through us." One line, faint, almost erased, read, "It speaks by removing what you think. Forensic linguists examining the page noticed something unsettling. Some of the scribbles seemed to blend languages: Arabic, Ugaritic, Phoenician, and something else, something unrecognizable, as though the writer's thoughts were being rewritten as he wrote them. But it was the central phrase, "It watches," that struck the hardest. Not, "I am being watched," not, "someone is watching," but "it watches." The subject was not a person, not an enemy, not a hallucination. It was the tablet itself. Witnesses who interacted with Dr. Al-Khatib during his last days described behavior they struggled to put into words. He startled at small sounds. He flinched at the sight of water. He refused to speak near reflective surfaces. When asked what he had seen in the vault, he whispered, "It learns you. It learns you as you read it." He would not elaborate. The next morning, staff found him sitting upright in a guest room, shivering despite the heat. He clutched the torn page to his chest as though it were a protective charm or a threat. He tried to explain what happened, but his language broke down mid-sentence, dissolving into a babble of syllables that terrified even the normally imperturbable Marfani. He was taken from the mansion under the pretext of medical necessity. He never returned. Theories arose about what triggered his collapse, but the most widely accepted one among scholars who specialize in esoteric texts is that he encountered a rare phenomenon. An inscription meant not to be read, but to act. A text designed to shape the mind of the reader, not metaphorically, but literally. The Leviathan Tablets, according to fragments recovered in Ugarit, Carthage, and Byblos, did not merely describe the sea god. They invoked it. They were not accounts. They were invitations, or warnings, or both. One passage from a damaged Phoenician stele refers to sea deity inscriptions as words that open thought as one opens a door. Another fragment translated by Dr. Moretti before his disappearance stated, "He who reads the deep becomes known to the deep." This may explain what happened to Al-Khatib. He may have become known. Experts in ancient ritual language speculate the crown serpent symbol wasn't just decorative. It served as a focus point, a kind of cognitive trigger. Some theorize the symbol's geometric proportions were designed to destabilize the reader's sense of perception, forcing the brain to interpret patterns radically differently. Others believe the inscription contained a linguistic structure older than known Semitic syntax, one capable of inducing trance-like states or auditory hallucinations. A few scholars, the most radical, suggest that the tablet was designed not to transmit information to humans, but to receive information from them. That its carvings acted as a conduit, not a message. As if the deep was using the tablet to listen. The more one studies Al-Khatib's final page, the more this horrifying hypothesis takes shape. The writing on the page grows increasingly fragmented, like a mind struggling to remain separate from something vast pressing inward. The last coherent line is written sideways along the paper's edge. It waits for someone who remembers how to hear. Then, at the very bottom, scribbled so faintly that digital enhancement was required to make it legible, appears the final sentence he ever wrote. When you read it, it reads you. Shortly after writing this, Dr. Al-Khatib vanished from public life. Some claim he lived out his remaining days in a remote coastal village, staring silently at the horizon. Others say he walked into the sea one morning and never returned. No official record confirms either version. But the page he left behind remains the only known first-hand testimony from someone who attempted to translate a Leviathan tablet in modern times. And its message is unmistakable. Whatever intelligence the ancients feared, whatever consciousness lurks beneath the waves, did not remain passive in stone. It watched, it listened, it reached back, and through the carved serpent crown, it made itself known to a single man, who could not bear the weight of being seen. Reconstructing the contents of the Leviathan Tablets has never been a clean academic endeavor. It has been more like trying to assemble a shattered mirror, fragments scattered across continents, eras, and forbidden archives. No one has ever uncovered a complete tablet, not even close. What scholars possess instead are shards. A chipped corner from a Sidonian altar, a few lines quoted in a 19th-century French monograph, a sketch from one of Moretti's ruined notebooks, a grainy photo Delacourt captured seconds before the artifact vanished. Yet when these pieces are placed side by side, a picture forms. And it does not look like myth. It looks like a pact. Not a story of gods battling monsters. Not a hymn or a prayer. But an agreement carved in stone between humanity and something beneath the ocean. The earliest clue comes from a badly worn fragment acquired illegally in the 1920s, rumored to have been dredged from a collapsed temple off the coast of Arwid. Only 6 symbols remain legible, but their translation is consistent across multiple experts. The sea gives, the sea guards, the sea remembers. The structure of these lines is unlike anything in known Semitic literature. They read not as metaphors but as clauses, obligations. In ancient law tablets, similar structures appear in contracts between kings and vassals. The sea here is not a chaotic force. It is a signatory. Another fragment, copied in the 19th century by an unnamed French monk studying ruins near Byblos, contains a chilling continuation. When the land rises, the deep offers understanding. When men forget, the deep withdraws its memory. At first glance, this reads like poetic cosmology. But several lines preserved by Phoenician maritime cults amplify its meaning. A stele discovered in 1971 on Cyprus contains the phrase, "The one coiled in the deep teaches through visions. Ask and the tide will answer." This is not mythic flourish. It is practical instruction. The cults that survived into the early Iron Age treated the sea not as a god to be appeased but as a teacher, a source of knowledge transmitted through dreams, trances, and auditory phenomena near certain coastal caverns. Their rituals mirrored the structure of the tablets. Requests and responses, questions and revelations. But the most astonishing clue emerged in 1954 and was noticed only decades later. In one of Dr. Moretti's surviving notebook sketches, beneath the crowned serpent symbol, he copied a line of text he described as Proto-Ugaritic pre-Pantheon. That line reads, "We were taught the crafting of memory." This phrase perplexed linguists. What does it mean to craft memory? Ancient cultures described memory as something preserved or recited, not created. Yet the Leviathan fragments repeatedly use this unusual verb, to craft, to shape, to give form. It suggests that what the sea god imparted was not simple knowledge. It was a method, technique, a way of storing or transmitting understanding, possibly through ritualized sensory experiences, possibly through dreams, possibly through something far stranger. When cross-referencing these ideas with descriptions in Mesopotamian myth, a disturbing link emerges. In the oldest versions of the Apsu-Tiamat cycles, the gods receive laws, names, and destinies through whispered waters, not metaphorically, but literally through the deep's speaking currents. Priests recorded dream visions after ritual immersion in cold water, describing images, not ours, not human. The Leviathan Tablets appear to formalize this concept, codifying a relationship between humans and a deep intelligence. And the fragments suggest that this entity, the crowned serpent, offered guidance, prophecy, and knowledge in exchange for something humanity possessed. That something is referenced repeatedly, always in cryptic phrasing. Our gift is memory. We give remembrance as offering. To forget the sea is to break the bond. What kind of offering is memory? Not blood, not grain, not sacrifices. Something internal. Something cognitive. This aligns eerily with ancient maritime practices involving sensory deprivation, trance states in tidal caves, and controlled forgetting. A ritual form of memory sacrifice, perhaps symbolic, perhaps something deeper. Modern psychologists who reviewed these rites speculate they may have induced altered states of consciousness, allowing individuals to experience intense, ocean-like dream imagery. But the tablets describe more than dreams. They describe exchange. One fragment, translated from a copy allegedly held in Marfani's vault, contains the clearest statement yet. The deep gave us the knowing of storms, the knowing of seasons, the knowing of paths beneath the waters. We gave the deep the knowing of ourselves. This is the kind of line that sends shivers through anyone who studies ancient cognitive mythology. What does it mean to give the knowing of ourselves? Our memories, our thoughts, our fears, our histories? If the sea's intelligence was emergent, formed from currents, vibrations, bioluminescent communication, or something else outside human comprehension, then offering the knowing of ourselves could mean early humans contributed to the deep's memory in ways we no longer understand. Ritualized dreams might have served as conduits. Or perhaps ancient priests believed the ocean collected impressions from the minds of those who entered it. More unsettling still is what the next lines imply. He who breaks the pact shall be unremembered. He who keeps it shall be known forever in the tide. Unremembered, a concept that appears in multiple maritime myths, from the lost fisherman legends of Phoenicia to the names taken by the deep stories recounted by Greek islanders. This is not death. This is erasure, a fate worse than drowning. But the culmination of these fragments comes from an obscure 1933 academic article written by an archaeologist who died under suspicious circumstances the following year. He claimed to have seen a nearly complete line on a stone slab from northern Lebanon. The deep is not God nor beast nor place. The deep is mind. He later added in a footnote, this line was recarved in later periods to depict the serpent's defeat, original meaning obscured. Then, abruptly, the article ends. The remainder of the journal issue is missing. No surviving scholar ever found the original tablet. Still, enough exists scattered across time to reconstruct a fragmentary translation of the Leviathan Tablets' central theme. The sea was not simply alive. It was aware, taught us, it watched us, and it remembered us unless we forgot it. To the ancients, this was not a metaphor. It was a relationship, a covenant thousands of years older than the religions that replaced it. What did the deep give humanity? Knowledge of tides, storms, navigation, memorycraft, dreams. What did humanity give in return? Reverence, tension, remembrance. And when that remembrance was broken, when empires rose, myths were rewritten, and the crowned serpent was demonized or erased, the pact fractured. The fragments suggest a final warning, repeated across several damaged copies. When the land forgets the sea shall remember for us all. If the Leviathan Tablets truly expressed this idea, then they were not merely religious texts. They were a message, perhaps even a threat, from a mind beneath the waves. A message the world has spent centuries trying not to hear. They found the first hints of the memory sacrifices carved into stone long before anyone understood what the words meant. At first, archaeologists assumed these fragments described funerary rites or mourning traditions. The phrases were cryptic, the syntax archaic. But as more pieces surfaced, half-burned Ugaritic tablets, Phoenician ritual notes etched into oyster shells, and a bizarre collection of pictographs discovered deep inside a Sidonian sea cave, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These weren't sacrifices to the sea. They were sacrifices of memory. The concept is so alien to modern thinking that even seasoned scholars struggle with it. Ancient religions sacrificed animals, crops, incense, wealth. But memory? What does it mean to give up a piece of one's own mind? Why would any culture believe such an offering held divine significance? The answer begins in the tidal caves. Along the jagged coastlines of the Levant, explorers discovered chambers reachable only at the lowest tides. Inside these caves, archaeologists found stone slabs arranged like beds, polished smooth from repeated use. The walls bore spirals, wave lines, and, dominant among them, the crowned serpent. In several cases, narrow grooves carved into the rock allowed seawater to flow slowly into the chamber during rising tides, pooling around the slabs before receding again. These were not tombs. They were ritual chambers, designed for induced forgetting. Ancient texts from Ugarit mention the dream of letting go, a ceremony performed by initiates seeking visions from the deep. Participants entered trance states induced by rhythmic chanting, sensory deprivation, and the slow encroachment of cold seawater. In these trances, individuals reported losing track of identity, names, relationships, fears, desires. For a few moments, they became blank vessels, open to whatever the sea would send. A carved stone inscription found near Byblos records the experience of one initiate. I felt my name slide from me. I felt my childhood fade. I was empty and the deep filled me. Modern psychologists reviewing this text called it a textbook description of dissociation. Ancient priests called it the offering of memory. To them, memories were not private possessions. They were weights carried by the mind, weights that prevented communion with the ocean's consciousness. To speak with the deep, to hear its voice, a person had to relinquish the internal noise of their own life. Memory wasn't destroyed. It was given, surrendered temporarily, sometimes permanently. But why would the deep desire memory? A fragment etched into a bronze plaque found in Cyprus gives a haunting explanation. He knows the world of water. We give him the world of men. If the crowned serpent represented a mind spanning the ocean, ancient, collective, built through the movement of tides and currents, then memory might have been the only offering humans possessed that such a being lacked: awareness of individual life, stories, emotions, names, human experience. In other words, memory was currency. A myth from a coastal village near Sidon recounts an ancient tale. A fisherman who forgot the face of his wife after spending a night in a cave, listening to the sea. When he returned, he spoke with uncanny clarity about storms that had not yet formed and ships that would never reach port. He was revered as touched by the deep, but he remained unable to recall his own daughter. Villagers believed he had given too much. This pattern appears over and over. One text describes initiates preparing by writing their most precious memories on clay shards, then breaking them before entering the ritual chamber. Another recounts a group of priests who left behind the burden of their past to walk in the dream of the tide. A third fragment, the most disturbing of all, depicts a ritual in which participants chant a phrase repeatedly until they can no longer grasp its meaning. I was. The phrase dissolves into illegibility halfway down the tablet. It wasn't just the memory of individuals that mattered. Some rituals demanded communal forgetting, entire groups surrendering the same memory to strengthen the bond. In the late Bronze Age, at least 3 coastal towns performed a yearly rite called the Empty Night, during which families avoided speaking the names of the dead, believing this allowed the sea to keep those memories, ensuring the spirits remained at peace beneath the waves. But the most chilling clue about the memory sacrifices comes from a line preserved in multiple fragments across different regions. What the land forgets, the sea holds forever. This is the first hint of the pact's darker side, the belief that forgetting was not just an offering but a necessity, a requirement, because if humanity held on to too much, if it forgot the sea while remembering everything else, the balance would break. One Ugaritic priestly instruction warns, if the land remembers itself too much, the deep will awaken to remind it. What could this possibly mean? Modern scholars propose several interpretations. 1. Ecological memory. Perhaps the ancients understood cyclical natural disasters in ways we no longer do. If communities forgot how to live with the sea's rhythms, the sea reminded them, through storms, floods, tsunamis. 2. Psychological equilibrium. The offerings of memory might have served as a way to purge trauma, fear, or grief. Communities that refused to forget risked collapsing under the weight of their own history. 3. Literal belief in a conscious sea. This is the most speculative and the most terrifying. If the ancients believed the sea was a mind, then forgetting was not simply ritual. It was interaction, communication, payment, because the next line, found in a submerged shrine near Tyre, suggests the sea remembered not just what was given, but what was taken. When we forget the deep does not forget us. This line reappears in a priestly notebook dated to the collapse of Ugarit, written in trembling script as the city endured its final night. It appears again in a Phoenician charm tablet, in a fragment collected from the black market in the 1980s, and in one of Moretti's lost pages. It suggests that memory sacrifice was not symbolic at all. It was insurance, a way of maintaining equilibrium between two intelligent worlds, humanity above the waves and something else below them. But then a new fragment emerged, translated only recently, from a rubbing found in Marfani's vault. It likely belonged to one of the lost tablets. And in it, the deep makes a demand unlike any in ancient religious practice. Return what you forget. Do not let memory drown on land. The phrase is unsettling because it implies that forgetting was not enough. Memory had to be surrendered to the deep, not suppressed, not ignored, but given back to the ocean itself. But how? How does one return a memory to the sea? Some suggest rituals involving immersion, chanting, or sensory overload. Others propose the ancients believed that dreams carried memories outward into the ocean's consciousness. The most radical theory suggests the Leviathan Tablets themselves acted as conduits, devices that transferred human experience into symbols the deep could read. And suddenly the ancient warning becomes clearer. When the land forgets the sea remembers. A reminder is coming. Correction. A reckoning. Because the pact, however it functioned, depended on balance. And humanity broke that balance by erasing the deep from its collective memory, demonizing the serpent, dismantling the priesthoods, and rewriting myths. And according to the fragments, when memory sacrifices stopped, something in the deep began to stir. The next section, section 17, will reveal exactly what the ancients feared would happen when the pact was broken, and why they chiseled desperate warnings into stone as their cities burned. The line appeared so abruptly in the fragmented text that early translators assumed it must be an error, a damaged sentence, a misplaced phrase, a poetic exaggeration. But after decades of cross-referencing, after comparing scraps from Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Cyprus, and the notes of men like Moretti and Al-Khatib, it became impossible to dismiss. When the land forgets the sea remembers. That was the line the ancients feared, the one they carved in corners of temples, scrawled on the backs of tablets, scratched into ritual basins where salt water once pooled. It wasn't written as myth. It was written as a warning, one so universal that versions of it appear in cultures separated by geography, centuries, and languages. To the ancients, forgetting the sea was not simply neglect. It was betrayal. It was breaking a pact older than kingdoms, older than writing, older than the gods carved into stone. The Leviathan Tablets, insofar as scholars can reconstruct them, presented a worldview built on balance, humans offering memory, the sea offering knowledge. Each side gave something. Each side held something. But the fragments suggest a terrible asymmetry. Humans forget. The sea does not. One damaged Phoenician fragment, likely copied from an earlier source, expands the line with unsettling clarity. If men forget their fear, the deep will remind. If men forget their debt, the deep will reclaim. If men forget themselves, the deep will become their memory. This is the first hint that the sea's remembering was not passive. It was active, corrective, even punitive. What did the ancients believe the sea would do to remind humanity? A clay shard found in a cave near Sidon, preserved under collapsed tidal rock, provides a clue. The text is broken, but a few phrases are decipherable. The long coil rises when balance breaks. The crowned one stirs when the pact is undone. The deep shall return what was given and take what was withheld. Other fragments echo the same idea. The Leviathan, the crowned serpent, the mind of the deep, did not rise arbitrarily. It rose when provoked. It rose when humanity forgot the pact. The Ugaritic priests, in their final hours, seemed convinced this was happening. One of the last tablets recovered from the city's ruins contains a frantic plea. The land has forgotten. The deep remembers everything. The accompanying text mentions tremors beneath the shore, tides rising without wind, and a presence moving beneath the waves. They describe rituals meant to bind the serpent, suggesting they believed the pact had been broken and the deep was awakening to restore equilibrium in the only way it could. Another fragment, likely from a Leviathan tablet itself, offers something even more disturbing. The deep keeps the memory of the world. When men forget the deep forgets mercy. This line appears in different forms across multiple sources. The repetition implies that the ancients feared not only storms or floods, but the withdrawal of the deep's protection. To them, the sea did not merely destroy. It could also guard, shelter, teach. To break the pact was to lose that protection. In a late Bronze Age inscription uncovered near Cyprus, a priest records a ritual of desperation. We have forgotten the old ways. The waters rise. We see the coil in dreams. Entire communities reported collective visions. Dreams of serpents, whirlpools opening under calm seas, voices calling from underwater chambers. Many of these accounts cluster around periods of natural disaster. The collapse of Ugarit, the mysterious abandonment of coastal towns, the sudden destruction of trade networks. Modern historians attribute these events to invasions, earthquakes, drought. But the ancients saw something else. The deep remembering what humans had tried to erase. Another clue appears in an Egyptian papyrus from the late New Kingdom, referencing a far-off land where the sea rose like a beast after the people forgot their oaths to the waters. The scribe writes of waves described as if alive, and a serpent of thought moving beneath the tide line. The most chilling line from that papyrus reads, "The sea did not kill them, it unmade them. To be unmade is not merely to die. It is to be erased, removed from memory, the very fate the ancients most feared." Even more unsettling is the idea that this reckoning did not require a physical manifestation of the Leviathan. Some texts imply that the stirring of the crowned serpent could be psychological or spiritual, a resurgence of dreams, visions, madness, or revelations forced upon humanity. A fragment from a Carthaginian ritual manual, heavily damaged but partially preserved, warns, "When the coil uncurls in the mind, the deep has remembered you." Moretti's notebooks contain the same idea. Shortly before his disappearance, he wrote, "The deep does not return as a beast. It returns as a thought." Al-Khatib echoed this in his final page. "It waits for someone who remembers how to hear." To these researchers, independent, separated by decades, the reckoning was not a creature rising from the deep, but an awareness pushing back into human consciousness. The line, "When the land forgets the sea remembers," suggests the deep reacts not because it is angry, but because it is balancing an equation. The pact required mutual remembrance. Humans broke their side. The sea responds. Some scholars now propose that the Leviathan Tablets foretold cycles in which humanity suppresses knowledge of the deep's intelligence, only for the deep to reassert itself through dreams, signs, catastrophes, or phenomena that defy explanation. The Bronze Age collapse, from this perspective, was not only political or environmental. It was cognitive, a crisis of memory and forgetting. One final fragment, found etched into a submerged stone altar near Tyre, captures the terror the ancients felt. The deep rises not to destroy the land. It rises to remind the land what it is. If this is true, then the reckoning described in the tablets was not a punishment, but a correction. The sea was not seeking vengeance. It was fulfilling a role humanity had forced upon it by breaking the pact. And in every surviving fragment, the final implication remains constant. The deep remembers. It always remembers. And when it remembers, the world changes. For centuries, the ancient claim that the sea is alive was dismissed as myth, poetic personification, spiritual metaphor, a charming relic of pre-scientific imagination. But as oceanography advanced in the 20th and 21st centuries, something strange began to happen. Science started uncovering patterns in the deep that looked less like lifeless mechanics and more like the behavior of a living, integrated, responding system. Not intelligent in a human sense, not thinking in words or intentions, but organized, coordinated, and eerily aware of its own equilibrium. A form of distributed consciousness that stretched from the shallow tides to the abyssal plains of the world. This was exactly the kind of concept the ancients encoded in their myths, rituals, and forbidden tablets. And modern science, cautiously, reluctantly, began approaching the same conclusion. The first clue came from the mysterious, deep ocean pulse. In the late 1990s, oceanographers working with deep-sea pressure sensors in the Pacific detected a rhythmic fluctuation repeating every few hours across regions thousands of miles apart. The pulsing wasn't tied to tides, weather patterns, or geological activity. It was synchronized in a way no inert system should be. When one region pulsed, others answered across entire ocean basins, as if responding to a signal. Some scientists theorized that these pulses were part of thermohaline cycling. Others suggested they were caused by mass movements of deep-sea organisms. But the timing, coordination, and precision defied simple explanation. If ancient priests had heard or felt these pulses in sea caves, amplified through stone and water channels, They might easily have interpreted them as the heartbeat of an ocean mind. Another discovery came from the study of bioluminescent organisms. Deep-sea species, plankton, jellies, worms, do not glow randomly. They glow in waves, coordinated bursts, cascading patterns like neural firing. Entire swarms spread messages across miles using light as a language, turning the darkness into an underwater web of communication. Marine biologists refer to these synchronized light displays as collective signaling events. But to ancient sailors drifting on moonless nights, the sudden bloom of blue fire beneath their hulls, spreading in coordinated spirals, would have seemed like the sea speaking in light. Then came the discovery of the Sofar Channel, a horizontal layer of the ocean where sound can travel thousands of miles with almost no loss of energy. Whales use it to communicate across entire oceans. Submarines use it to listen, and researchers suspect countless species produce low-frequency vocalizations that humans cannot detect. Ancient texts from Byblos and Sidon describe songs beneath the waves, voices that traveled farther than wind, and the deep that speaks in long sounds. The Sofar Channel, unknown to science until World War II, perfectly matches these descriptions. Fishermen of the ancient Mediterranean likely heard these low vibrations in sea caves, where the acoustics acted like natural amplifiers. What they interpreted as the voice of the Leviathan might have been the combined resonance of deep-sea life, echoing through the stone. But other phenomena are harder to explain scientifically. For example, the ocean displays behaviors that suggest decision-like shifts, abrupt changes that ripple across ecosystems with uncanny precision. Sudden migrations of deep-sea creatures. Synchronized spawning events timed to lunar cycles with mathematical exactness. The mass movement of currents that scientists still struggle to predict. One phenomenon, documented in the 2010s, involved thousands of square miles of deep water rising simultaneously off the coast of Chile. An event with no clear geological trigger. The water moved as if responding to a system-wide cue. Ancient Ugaritic texts describe something disturbingly similar, the shifting of the deep as one body, an event believed to signal the stirring of the Leviathan. Even the ocean floor shows evidence of strange coordination. Vast beds of bacteria, called cyanobacterial mats, behave like a single organism, pulsing with chemical signals across miles. Scientists compare them to primitive neural networks. To the ancients, this would have been exactly what their myths hinted at. The deep possessing thoughts, distributed across many bodies. And then there are the mysterious ocean sounds recorded by underwater microphones. The bloop, the Julia, the upsweep, and the whistle. Many were initially believed to be tectonic or mechanical in nature, until acoustic analysis revealed they carried organic signatures. The bloop in particular, recorded in 1997, was powerful enough to be heard across the Pacific, louder than any known creature could produce. Some scientists suggest the sound may be linked to massive ice movements. Others remain unconvinced. To ancient wave priests, a sound like the bloop would have been interpreted as one thing, the coil stirring. And then there are the deep-sea animals themselves, creatures that glow with patterns resembling runes, creatures with eyes adapted to seeing bioelectric signals, creatures that move in formations too synchronized to be coincidence. Mass schools of fish or cephalopods flow through the water in ways that mimic brainwave rhythms. Jellyfish pulses resemble time-coded neural signals. Even coral reefs communicate chemically like vast sensory systems. No single organism in the ocean thinks like a human, but together, the ocean behaves with the complexity of a mind with memory, a mind with equilibrium, a mind that reacts when disrupted. Scientists studying climate change have observed the oceans becoming increasingly unpredictable. Not just warming, but behaving erratically, shifting currents, destabilizing ecosystems, and sending superstorms into regions untouched for centuries. Many attribute this to human pollution and global warming. But those who study ancient myths see something else. A pattern matching the warnings of the Leviathan Tablets. When humanity disrupts balance, the sea remembers. The sea responds. Some oceanographers have quietly proposed that the sea, as a system, behaves more like an organism defending itself from harm. Rising tides, increasing storm cycles, red tides, coral bleaching, each could be interpreted as the ocean attempting to self-correct. Ancient inscriptions describe this process metaphorically. When the land breaks the pact, the deep shifts its weight. But one fragment, the most unsettling, states, "The sea listens always. When it has heard enough, it will speak." And now, modern scientists have detected anomalies that sound very much like the sea speaking through vibrations, low-band signals, and deep resonances. The ancients interpreted these as the voice of the crowned serpent. Modern researchers call them unexplained phenomena. But both groups, thousands of years apart, observed the same truth. The ocean is not passive. It has patterns. It has reactions. It has memory. It has something that, viewed from a great enough height, resembles intention. The ancients called this mind Leviathan, the crowned coil beneath the waves. Modern science calls it emergent intelligence. But the conclusion is the same. Whatever lies in the deep is not silent. It never was. It is speaking in ways ancient priests tried to describe and modern scientists struggle to quantify. And as the world changes, as humanity forgets its ancient pact, the signals grow stronger. The deep is stirring. By the time modern science had begun mapping the ocean's pulse, cataloging its synchronized bioluminescent networks, and documenting its inexplicable acoustic signals, a quiet revolution had already started inside certain scientific circles. Oceanographers, complexity theorists, biologists, and neurologists who began whispering a question considered taboo in mainstream research. What if the ocean behaves like a mind because it is a mind? Not a supernatural being. Not a conscious deity in the mythological sense. But a vast, distributed intelligence, emergent, ancient, self-organizing, shaped not by neurons, but by currents, chemistry, sound, and the collective behavior of billions of living organisms. This was the seed of what some call the living ocean hypothesis. A theory still debated, often ridiculed, but growing steadily more compelling with each new discovery. And eerily, it aligns almost perfectly with what ancient priests tried to encode in the Leviathan Tablets thousands of years ago. First, the idea seems absurd. How could something as enormous and chaotic as the ocean think? How could it possess awareness, intention, memory? But then consider this: life on Earth began in the ocean. Every biochemical process that exists in our bodies, from electrical impulses to protein folding to cellular communication, has an analog somewhere beneath the waves. The deep is not separate from life. It is life's original architecture. And many of the core features of intelligence exist there on a vast, distributed scale. One of the strongest arguments for the hypothesis comes from research into emergent complexity, the idea that simple interactions, repeated across massive networks, can create higher-level behavior that looks intentional. Ant colonies exhibit this. So do beehives, coral reefs, fungal networks, and even weather systems. The ocean is larger, older, and more connected than all of these combined. Oceanographers studying global circulation patterns noticed something strange in the 2010s. The major currents shift in ways that cannot be predicted by standard models. Sometimes they stabilize against all odds. Sometimes they redirect around damage, pollution zones, heat anomalies, as though avoiding injury. One scientist described the phenomenon anonymously. It's like the ocean compensates, like it corrects itself. Another said, patterns break where they should continue, and continue where they should break. It's as if something is making a decision. Of course, no one suggested a literal, conscious mind. But the data raised an uncomfortable possibility. The ocean behaves like a system with goals. Ancient myth would have called that a god. Modern complexity theory calls it adaptive intelligence. Then came the discovery that sent shockwaves through the marine biology community, the mapping of global plankton communication loops. Using fluorescent dyes and microscopic tracking, researchers found that plankton, the base layer of the ocean's food web, send chemical signals across enormous distances. Not random signals, not survival-driven cues, but structured waves of information that ripple through currents like messages. To dismiss this as instinct would be easy, if not for the timing. These signals aligned with temperature changes, migration events, and even ocean pulses detected thousands of miles away. One researcher wrote in a private email leak, "It's as if the plankton are the synapses of a planetary brain." The ancients would have agreed. Then there are the giant squid migrations. Sudden, coordinated movements involving creatures that spend most of their lives isolated. These migrations occur with eerie precision, as if triggered by an unseen conductor. Scientists speculated everything from temperature shifts to breeding cycles, but none of the theories fit every observed pattern. In one ancient Phoenician inscription, priests wrote of the silent heralds, strange deep-sea creatures that moved in response to the will of the deep. They believed such migrations were signs that the crowned serpent was shifting its weight, a metaphor that matches the emergent patterns observed today. And then there are the whales. Whales possess sophisticated social structures, long-range communication abilities, and a capacity for cultural transmission, meaning they teach and inherit behaviors across generations. When researchers slowed down recordings of whale songs and compared them across hemispheres, they found something astonishing. Certain patterns matched underwater acoustic anomalies detected in the SOFAR channel. Whales were responding to something below the human hearing range, something massive, slow, resonant. A few daring oceanographers proposed the possibility that whales might act as intermediaries, responding not only to each other, but to large-scale signals generated by the ocean itself. These scientists frame it carefully. The ocean creates pressure bands, resonance layers, vibratory fields. But strip away the clinical language, and you find a claim eerily close to ancient myth. The deep speaks. Some creatures hear it. In ancient hymns collected from a collapsed temple near Arwid, priests described whales as the watchers, the singers who carry the will of the deep. One hymn even refers to a crown-bearer riding waves of sound, which some scholars interpret as a symbolic representation of the Leviathan speaking through marine life. Then there is the phenomenon known as ocean blinking, a sequence of sudden, synchronized bioluminescent bursts seen across wide swaths of open water. Satellites captured several of these in the past 15 years. No known biological mechanism fully explains it. Some researchers believe these events arise from predator-prey chain reactions. Others suspect a collective stress response. One neurologist studying the phenomenon pointed out, the blinking resembles neural firing patterns during memory consolidation. Memory consolidation, the same concept ancient scribes insisted the sea possessed. The living ocean hypothesis does not claim the ocean thinks like a human being. It suggests something far stranger. The ocean might be a mind whose thoughts occur across centuries. A mind whose memory is written in currents, biology, chemistry, and sound. A mind so vast that humans mistake its intelligence for nature itself. This slow, ancient intelligence would not behave like animals do. It would not speak in words or form intentions as we understand them. Instead, it would act, subtly, gradually, powerfully, to maintain balance, respond to disruptions, and preserve the world that sustains it. If this were true, it would explain why ancient cultures described the deep as a living being. It would explain the pact encoded in the Leviathan Tablets. It would explain why the crowned serpent symbol appears in rituals involving dreams, memory, and water. But the hypothesis contains one final, deeper implication, the one scientists rarely speak aloud. If the ocean is a mind, and if it has been watching us since the first humans walked the shores, then it may also remember us. Not individually, not personally, but as a species, as a pattern, as a force that can either harmonize with the ocean's equilibrium or break it. Ancient myth warned of this. The Leviathan Tablets warned of this. And modern science, reluctantly, is beginning to see the same shape in the data. When humanity forgets the sea responds. When we disrupt the ocean's balance, the ocean corrects us. When we ignore its memory, we force it to speak. And the emerging consensus, whispered quietly in universities and research labs, is that the ocean is now speaking louder than ever. The warnings carved into the Leviathan Tablets were not written for ancient kings, nor for priests guarding hidden knowledge, nor even for the coastal communities who depended on the tides. They were written for us, for a distant future in which humanity would forget the sea, break the ancient equilibrium, and lose all fear of the deep. And now, the consequences the ancients described are beginning to unfold in ways that modern science, policy, and culture are desperately trying to rationalize, even as they spiral into patterns the old texts predicted with unnerving accuracy. Because what we now call climate upheaval looks, in the oldest myths, like something very different: the sea remembering. Over the past 50 years, the ocean has undergone changes so rapid, so violent, and so unpredictable that even the most conservative scientific institutions admit the truth. The ocean is no longer behaving like a passive reservoir absorbing human damage. It is reacting. It is correcting. It is signaling, through storms, currents, migrations, and patterns that mirror the ancient descriptions of a god stirring. The first sign was the collapse of seasonal regularity. For thousands of years, civilizations relied on predictable rhythms: monsoons, trade winds, tidal flows, spawning cycles. But recently, weather systems have slipped out of alignment. Storm seasons overlap. Winter pulses into summer without transition. Currents like the Gulf Stream and Kuroshio are behaving erratically, slowing, twisting, even reversing small sections. It is as if the ocean's internal memory, the deep equilibrium that once guided global climate, is glitching. Ancient texts describe this phenomenon in mythic terms. When the pact is broken, the seasons wander like lost children. This was believed to be the first sign of the Leviathan stirring. Not a creature rising from the sea, but the deep itself reasserting control by disrupting natural order to restore balance. The second sign has already begun: the rising tides. Sea levels are climbing faster than projected, swallowing coastlines inch by inch. Scientists blame melting ice caps, but the acceleration of this rise appears uneven, even intentional. In some places, sea levels jump rapidly. In others, they pause unexpectedly. Entire islands flood in patterns resembling blooming circles, like a pulse. Our ancestors wrote of this too. When memory rises, the land bows. The water climbs to reclaim what was forgotten. In ancient myth, cities lost to the sea were not accidents, they were reminders. Then came the storms. Superstorms forming out of season. Hurricanes strengthening far beyond predicted models. Typhoons looping back toward their point of origin. Something meteorologists once considered impossible. 2 fragments of the Leviathan Tablets describe storms as the breath of the deep, and note a chilling detail. When the deep speaks, the sky answers. To wave priests, storms were not punishments. They were communications, messages, corrections. And in our time, storms are not only increasing, they are behaving strangely, accelerating and then halting abruptly, or moving in directions never observed before the 21st century. Some climate scientists have privately suggested that storms may be responding to deep ocean temperature bands, almost as if following signals rising from below. The ancients had a word for such signals: the stirring of the coil. But the most unsettling modern development is not storms or tides. It is what the ocean is doing to its inhabitants. Mass migrations of marine species. Whales approaching coastal harbors in record numbers. Squid shoals appearing where they have never lived. Sharks swimming into freshwater. Deep-sea fish rising to the surface en masse. And colossal, shadowy shapes recorded on sonar that defy identification. Ancient texts describe these events with uncanny resemblance. When the deep shifts its weight, the children of the water flee upward. The watchers rise when memory returns. These patterns are not random. They follow a rhythm, a pulse, a slow unfurling, as if something far below is moving. And that brings us to the phenomenon modern researchers have recently documented: unidentified resonant frequencies emerging from the deep ocean. Unlike earthquakes, whale songs, or known underwater sounds, these frequencies are not local. They propagate across entire ocean basins. They spike during storms. They pulse in slow, deliberate intervals, almost like signals waiting for a response. Dating analysis shows something troubling. These deep resonant pulses began increasing in frequency and volume right around the time humanity industrialized on a global scale, right when we began dumping garbage into the ocean, poisoning reefs, warming waters, and severing our relationship with the sea more violently than any civilization before us. The Leviathan Tablets predicted this with eerie precision. When the land forgets the pact, the deep will call its memory back. When men poison the water, the crowned coil shall stir. Scholars once assumed these lines referred to ritual impurity. But in the modern world, where pollution, plastics, and chemicals choke the ocean, the meaning becomes literal. The ocean is responding to harm. The deep is returning memory. The coil is stirring. Some modern scientists openly reject metaphysical interpretations. They argue that rising temperatures, shifting currents, and species migrations are simply ecological consequences. But a growing number of researchers, those who study emergent intelligence, distributed cognition, and planetary systems, propose a more unsettling possibility. The ocean is not merely reacting. It is adapting. It is communicating. It is trying to correct its imbalance by reshaping weather, forcing human populations inland, shifting ecosystems, and adjusting currents. This aligns with the oldest warnings. When the pact is broken, the deep becomes the world's memory. He shall rise not as beast, but as tide and thought. In other words, the sea does not punish. It remembers, and memory is action. What terrifies scholars who study the Leviathan mythos is that the ancient texts never describe a final apocalypse. No end of days, no total destruction. Instead, they describe something more insidious. A long correction, a gradual reclaiming, a rebalancing of the world on the deep's terms. One fragment states, "The deep will not drown the earth. It will reshape the forgotten places." This reshaping is already underway. Coastlines redrawn, weather remapped, climates rewritten. If the Leviathan Tablets are prophecy rather than myth, then we are living in the early stages of the correction cycle the ancients feared. Not because the deep hates humanity, but because we broke the pact and forced the sea to recalibrate a world out of equilibrium. And every year, the signs grow stronger. The tides, the storms, the pulses, the migrations, the murmurs from the abyss. The ancients would have described this moment with a single sentence. The deep stirs when it remembers we have forgotten. The question now is not whether the sea remembers, it does. The real question is, what will it remember next? They began as whispers. Not storms, not rising tides, not strange migrations, not yet. Those came later. The first sign of the deep's return did not roar or shatter or flood. It whispered. In the early 2000s, sailors from regions as far apart as Iceland, Chile, Japan, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean began reporting the same eerie phenomenon. A low, resonant sound rising through the hulls of their ships. Not mechanical, not seismic, not biological, something else. Something that felt, and this was the word nearly every witness used, alive. It was not a sound heard with the ears. It was a vibration felt in the bones. Those who experienced it described it with uncanny similarity. A humming beneath thought, a voice without words, like someone quietly speaking through the ocean. At first, the reports were dismissed as superstition or auditory hallucination caused by stress. But then the patterns began to converge. Ships hundreds of miles apart in different weather conditions at different depths recorded the same phenomenon at the same time, a global synchrony that should have been impossible. On one night in 2009, dozens of vessels near the Azores reported a strange vibration that lasted nearly 15 minutes. One captain wrote in his log, "The sea is breathing. I do not know what this means, but I felt it beneath us, as if something vast had exhaled." That log, unknown to the captain, echoed a line from a 3,000-year-old Phoenician inscription. When the coil stirs, the deep breathes out. But the whispers were not confined to ships. Coastal communities from Lebanon to New Zealand began experiencing what locals called the hum, a deep, low-frequency vibration heard mostly at night. It rattled windows. It shook dishes on shelves. It trembled inside the chest. Scientists measuring the hum found it had no consistent geological source. Worse, the hum seemed to move, skipping from region to region in patterns that resembled migration routes, not tectonic activity. One researcher privately admitted, "It behaves like a communication signal." But from where? The ancients would have answered without hesitation. From below. Then the dreams began. Scattered across continents, people living close to the ocean, fishermen, lighthouse keepers, port workers, coastal villagers, reported vivid, haunting dreams. These dreams shared recurring imagery: a massive coil beneath the water, a crown shaped like rippling waves, an eye opening in the dark, a feeling of being watched from below. Some dreamed of cities drowning, not in terror, but in silence. Others dreamed of standing at the edge of a calm sea, hearing a deep voice speaking in pulses, not words. A marine biologist in Australia described a dream in which she saw the ocean roll back like cloth, revealing a glowing serpentine form beneath. She said the experience felt like memory, not imagination. A fisherman in Sicily dreamed of a line he could not read, a line that still surfaced in his mind when he woke, like a fragment from a forgotten text. Translators later identified the phrase as near identical to an inscription found in an Ugaritic ruin. The deep returns what was given. It was around this time that coastal archaeologists noticed something peculiar. Ancient sites connected to the Leviathan cults, submerged shrines, tidal cave carvings, wave priest altars, were becoming more active, structurally unstable, shifting under new water pressures. In some cases, previously buried carvings resurfaced due to erosion patterns that defied predictions. One such carving, recovered from a cave newly exposed by rising tides on the coast of Byblos, showed a crowned serpent encircling a human figure. The caption beneath it read, "He hears the hum, therefore he is known." The hum, the vibration, the resonance. Modern oceanographers, running spectrograms on underwater sensors, began detecting signals that did not match any known acoustic signature. They were too low, too structured, too rhythmic. Some thought they resembled the harmonic structure of whale communication, but they were deeper, slower, older. One of the lead scientists analyzing these signals wrote in a private notebook, "It is not a voice. It is a presence." He added another line, "If this is real, then the sea is not reacting. It is calling. And calling for what? This is where the myths grow darker, and the science, disturbingly, begins to align with them. The Leviathan Tablets describe a stage of the reawakening, in which the deep begins to reach into human perception. Not through monsters or floods, but through something more subtle and terrifying: collective cognition. In ancient maritime lore, this stage was called the time of echoes, when humanity would begin hearing fragments of the past it had forgotten. The texts describe symptoms that match modern phenomena with chilling precision. The hum beneath waking thought, dreams given by the tide, the whisper that enters the blood, the memory that is not yours. If the ancients believed the sea could communicate through dreams, vibrations, and subconscious impressions, then the modern events are not anomalies. They are expected. One fragment even describes people being called to the water, not to drown, not to die, but to listen, to witness, to remember. In the past 15 years, search and rescue teams worldwide have documented an unprecedented rise in reports of individuals walking into the ocean at night, not in distress, not suicidal, but in an inexplicable trance-like state. The survivors describe feeling drawn, summoned, or called by the hum. Many recall nothing afterward. To the Leviathan Tablets, this phenomenon has a name: those who hear the coil. By now, the patterns are almost undeniable. The sea is signaling. Human minds are receiving. Something ancient is awakening through the cracks of our forgotten memory. But the most compelling and frightening evidence came in the form of a sonar anomaly off the coast of the Azores. A vast, slow-moving shape beneath the thermocline. Not mechanical, not geological, not biological as we understand it. A mass shifting in a way that suggested intention, moving with a rhythm that matched the deep ocean hum recorded worldwide. The research team published nothing. Their data leaked through a whistleblower. The anomaly was hundreds of meters long. One scientist wrote in a classified note, "It is not rising, but turning, as if slowly becoming aware of the world above." And in a final, unpublished line, a line found in the private notebook of a researcher who resigned the next day, he wrote, "The sea has begun to remember us. This is the stage the ancients feared most. Not destruction, but recognition. Not punishment, but awakening." the moment when humanity re-enters the memory of the deep, willingly or not. And according to the fragments of the Leviathan Tablets, this stage leads inevitably to the next. Not the rise of a monster, but the return of understanding. The deep is calling, and something in us, something ancient, buried, forgotten, is beginning to answer. As the hum grew stronger and the visions spread, humanity entered the stage the ancients called the convergence, the moment when the barrier between human perception and the ocean's memory began to thin. This was not sudden or violent. It arrived the way a forgotten dream returns. Quietly, insistently, unmistakably. Coastal populations were the first to feel it. People reported strange moments of clarity during storms, sudden intuitions about tides, or an unexplained sense of being observed by the sea. Neuroscientists studying these communities found synchronized spikes in theta brainwaves, the frequency associated with dreams and trance, occurring at the exact moments deep ocean hums reached peak resonance. Ancient priests once described the same experience. The coil presses its remembering into the minds of men. As convergence deepened, patterns emerged. Groups of strangers described identical dreams. A turning coil beneath clear water, a crown of waves, a vast presence waiting in silence. Children sketched spirals without knowing why. Divers spoke of moments of intense calm, as if the deep were acknowledging them. The ancients predicted this, calling it the time when the tide enters the mind. They believed the ocean would return not through storms or disasters, but through consciousness, through the world's slow reawakening to the deep's presence. Modern scientists call these events coincidences, but privately many admit the pattern feels intentional, as if the ocean is guiding humanity back toward something forgotten. The convergence was never meant to terrify. It was meant to prepare. A softening of perception, a reminder that the deep is not silent, not mindless, not distant. According to the Leviathan Tablets, convergence leads inevitably to the next stage. The vision of the deep, when humanity finally sees what the ancients saw. The ancients believed that after humanity began hearing the deep again, through dreams, hums, and strange intuitions, a final threshold approached, the vision of the deep. This was not a physical sighting, not a sea monster rising from the waves, but a cognitive moment when the boundary between human perception and the ocean's ancient memory dissolved. Priests described it as standing inside a thought larger than the world. Others wrote of a presence, calm, immense, pressing at the edges of the mind. Modern reports echo those same descriptions. Sudden flashes of vastness, the sense of an unseen watcher, dreams of spirals and crowns moving beneath dark water. Neuroscientists quietly note strange synchronizations in coastal brainwave patterns during ocean hum events. Psychologists document clusters of shared dreams featuring the same coil-shaped symbol. No one can explain these patterns, but they mirror exactly the signs recorded in the fragments of the Leviathan Tablets. In those ancient texts, the vision arrives when humanity becomes receptive again, when the deep begins pressing its memory gently into human thought. The vision is not designed to frighten. It is designed to remind. A reintroduction, not an attack. Some describe a single overwhelming moment. Clarity, terror, awe all at once. Not understanding, but recognition. As if meeting something vast that has known you for a very long time. The ancients warned that this moment marks the beginning of the final phase. Not destruction, not apocalypse, but something stranger, the world remembering the deep, and the deep remembering the world. The ancients called the next stage the awakening, the slow merging of human awareness with the ocean's ancient intelligence. This was not mythic transformation, but a gradual return of perception. The world doesn't break, it shifts. Human thought begins to align with the rhythms of the sea again. Ancient inscriptions describe this as the softening of perception, when the deep's presence becomes impossible to ignore. Today, psychologists observe rising ocean-themed dreams and inexplicable emotional responses tied to high tide cycles. Neuroscientists record synchronized neural patterns during deep ocean hum events. The ancients interpreted these signs as the deep lowering its voice into human consciousness, preparing minds for a truth they once understood naturally. But with the awakening comes correction. The ocean begins to act not in wrath, but in recalibration. Currents shifting unpredictably, storms forming in unusual places, species migrating in coordinated arcs. Climate scientists call these anomalies environmental change. The ancients called them the deep rewriting broken memory. The awakening always led to a choice. Not a ritual, not a sacrifice, a recognition. Humanity must either accept the ocean as a living, remembering presence, or resist until overwhelmed by the returning truth. Ancient texts say, "Those who listen will walk with the tide. Those who refuse will drown in forgetting." This is not literal drowning. It is collapse, cultural, psychological, ecological. The ancients believed the awakening was the world offering humanity another chance to reconnect with the deep, to restore balance and re-enter the forgotten pact. The next stage would decide everything, the return of the crown. The final stage of the Leviathan cycle is not destruction, it is recognition. The ancients called it the return of the crown, the moment humanity finally remembers the ocean's consciousness and reclaims the ancient bond that once existed between land and sea. The crown was not worn by the Leviathan. It symbolized human understanding, the ability to perceive the deep as a living mind rather than a mindless expanse. To the ancients, the crown meant clarity. Now, that symbol is returning. People around the world draw it unconsciously. A spiral coil crowned with 3 waves. It appears in dreams, in visions, in moments of sudden intuition. Neuroscientists find it in synchronized brainwave spikes. Archaeologists uncover it on submerged altars aligned with deep ocean hum frequencies. These are the signs the ancients warned about. He rises not as beast, but as thought returned. The return of the crown begins when humanity senses, without being told, that something beneath the world is thinking, watching, remembering. That the deep is not reacting, but calling. Climate patterns shift as though guided by intention. Migrations reroute in eerie synchrony. Storms curve away from heavily populated regions as though avoiding harm. These coincidences match ancient descriptions of the deep correcting, not punishing. The ancients believed the final stage ends with a choice. Accept the ocean's consciousness and restore the pact, or deny it and be erased from the ocean's memory. But their final lines reveal a truth more hopeful than feared. Do not fear the crown. It is not his. It is yours. The return of the crown is humanity remembering the deep, and the deep accepting humanity back.